The doors of the great hall burst open before Alara Voss could steady her breath, and every eye in the room turned toward her, like blades catching the light. She had been summoned without warning, pulled from her chambers by 2 guards who would not meet her gaze, and now she stood alone on the cold marble floor, while the entire court watched in silence. At the far end of the hall, seated upon a throne carved from black stone, was Draven Ashgrove, the Alpha King of Veyrath. He did not rise when she entered. He did not smile, as he once did every time she walked into a room. His jaw was tight, his eyes distant, and beside him stood a man Alara despised more than any other in the kingdom, Lord Cassian, his cousin, wearing an expression that was far too satisfied for the moment unfolding. Alara felt her pulse quicken. Something was wrong. She could feel it in the air, thick and heavy, pressing against her chest like a hand closing around her throat. The royal physician stepped forward, holding a scroll sealed with the crown's insignia. He did not look at her either. No one did. It was as though she had already become invisible, already erased from the kingdom before a single word had been spoken. "Your Majesty," the physician said, addressing the king and not her. "The examination is complete. The Lady Alara Voss is unable to bear children. She is barren." The word barren struck her like a physical blow. For a moment, the entire hall seemed to tilt beneath her feet. She opened her mouth to speak, to demand an explanation, to ask how such a thing could be true, when she had felt nothing wrong, nothing unusual, nothing that would suggest her body had betrayed her in such a permanent and cruel way. But before she could form the words, King Draven rose from his throne. He did not look at her the way he used to. There was no warmth left in his gaze, no trace of the man who had once whispered promises to her beneath the stars on the night their bond was formed. His voice, when it came, was flat and cold, carrying easily across the silent hall. "An heir is the foundation of this kingdom," he said. "Without an heir, the bond between us serves no purpose. I release you from our mate bond, Alara Voss. You are no longer the future queen of Veyrath." Gasps rippled through the crowd, though none dared speak aloud. Alara felt the blood drain from her face. She searched his eyes for some sign that this was a mistake, some flicker of the man she loved fighting against the words leaving his mouth, but she found nothing, only distance. Only a wall she had never seen before, built so quickly and so completely that it felt as though the man standing before her was a stranger, wearing her mate's face. "Draven," she whispered, forgetting every rule of formality that bound her to silence in this room. "Look at me, please." He did not answer. Instead, he turned to the guards standing near the entrance and gave a single, sharp nod. That was all it took. That was the entire weight of the life she had built, dismissed with the smallest movement of his hand. The guards approached her, not roughly, but with the practiced efficiency of men following orders they did not question. One of them reached for her arm. "Do not touch me," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I will walk out on my own." She turned, before the tears could fall in front of the court, before Lord Cassian's smile could widen any further, before the whispers could grow louder around her. She walked the long length of the hall with her chin raised, though every step felt like walking across broken glass. She could feel Draven's eyes on her back, but she refused to turn around. She refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. Only when the heavy doors closed behind her, sealing her away from the hall and everyone in it, did her composure finally shatter. She pressed her back against the cold stone wall of the corridor and slid down until she was sitting on the floor, her knees pulled to her chest, her breath coming in short, painful gasps. She did not understand how everything had changed so quickly. Only 3 days ago, Draven had held her in his arms and spoken of their future, of the children they would raise together, of the kingdom they would build side by side. Now he had cast her aside as though she had never mattered at all. A pair of soft footsteps approached, and Alara looked up to see one of the palace attendants, a young woman named Bridget, standing a few feet away with a bundle of clothing in her arms. "My lady," Bridget said gently, her eyes full of sympathy she did not dare show too openly. "I have been instructed to help you gather your things. You are to leave the palace by nightfall." Alara wiped her face and forced herself to stand. She would not fall apart in front of the staff. She would not give anyone else in this palace a story to whisper about in the shadows. "Thank you, Bridget," she said quietly. "I will manage on my own." But she did not refuse the help entirely. and together they walked to the chambers Alara had once shared, with hope for a future that no longer existed. As she packed the few belongings that were truly hers, Ilara's mind raced with questions that had no answers. How could the physicians be so certain? She had felt no illness, no pain, nothing that would suggest her body was incapable of carrying a child. And why had Draven not fought for her, not questioned the report, not given her even a moment to speak in her own defense? She thought of Lord Cassian's smile, the way his eyes had gleamed with something close to triumph as the physician delivered his verdict. Cassian had never approved of her. He had made it clear from the beginning that he believed the king should marry someone from a more powerful bloodline, someone who could strengthen alliances, rather than a woman who had come from a modest family on the northern border. Alara had always dismissed his coldness as simple jealousy, but now, standing in the ruins of everything she had built, she could not shake the feeling that something more calculated had taken place. By the time the sun began to set, Alara stood at the palace gates with a single bag containing her belongings and nothing else. The guards who had once greeted her with respect now watched her leave with careful, unreadable expressions, as though uncertain how to treat a woman who had fallen so far in a single afternoon. She did not look back at the palace towers rising behind her, gleaming gold in the dying light. She did not allow herself to think of the life she had imagined there, the children she had once hoped to raise within those walls, the man she had loved with every part of her being. She simply walked forward, one foot in front of the other, until the palace disappeared behind the hills, and the road stretched empty before her. Night fell quickly, and with it came a cold wind that cut through her cloak. Alara had no clear destination, only a vague memory of a small village on the outskirts of the kingdom where her mother had once had a distant cousin. It was not much, but it was somewhere to go, somewhere far from the whispers and stares that would surely follow her name through every corner of Veyrath by morning. As she walked, exhaustion began to creep into her limbs, and something else settled alongside it. A strange, hollow ache that she could not quite name. It was more than heartbreak. It felt as though something inside her had been severed, torn away without warning, leaving behind a wound she did not yet understand. She pressed a hand to her stomach, without quite knowing why. A small, unconscious gesture that brought no comfort, only confusion. She pushed the feeling aside, telling herself it was simply grief, simply the shock of losing everything in a single day. There was no reason to think otherwise. The physicians had been certain. The king had accepted their verdict without hesitation. There was no room left for doubt. And yet, as she walked further into the darkness, leaving behind the only home she had known for the past 2 years, a small, quiet voice in the back of her mind refused to be silenced completely. Something did not feel right. Something about the swiftness of her rejection, the certainty of the diagnosis, the coldness in Draven's eyes, all of it gnawed at her with a persistence she could not ignore. She did not know, as she walked alone beneath a sky full of indifferent stars, that the truth would prove far stranger and far more dangerous than anything she could have imagined. She did not know that the ache inside her was not grief at all, but the first quiet sign of a secret that would one day shake the very foundations of the kingdom that had cast her out. For now, she knew only the cold wind against her face, the ache in her chest, and the long road stretching endlessly ahead of her, leading toward a future she could not yet see. The village of Hollowmere came into view just as the last light of the moon began to fade behind heavy clouds. Ilara had walked for nearly 2 days, stopping only to rest beneath trees or in the shelter of abandoned barns, surviving on the small amount of bread and dried fruit she had managed to pack before leaving the palace. Her feet ached, her cloak was damp from the morning mist, and her spirit felt as worn as the soles of her boots. Hollowmere was smaller than she remembered from childhood stories, a cluster of stone cottages nestled between rolling hills and a slow-moving river that caught the early light in silver ribbons. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the smell of fresh bread drifted through the narrow streets, a small comfort after the emptiness of the road. She found the cottage belonging to her mother's distant cousin, a woman named Mira, exactly where the old stories had described it, at the edge of the village near a grove of birch trees. Alara hesitated at the gate, suddenly uncertain whether she had any right to ask a stranger for shelter, but before she could turn away, the door opened. Mira was older than Alara had expected, her hair streaked with gray, her hands roughened by years of tending herbs and treating the sick, but her eyes were sharp and kind, And when she saw Ilara standing at the gate, exhausted and clearly troubled, she did not ask questions. She simply opened the door wider and gestured for her to come inside. "You look like you have walked further than your body can bear," Mira said, her voice carrying the practical warmth of someone who had spent a lifetime caring for others. "Sit, eat. The questions can wait until morning." Ilara wanted to protest, to explain herself, to apologize for arriving unannounced and uninvited. But the moment she sat down at the small wooden table, her body seemed to give out entirely. Tears she had been holding back for 2 days finally broke free, and she found herself telling Mira everything: the rejection, the accusation of being barren, the coldness in Draven's eyes, the long walk that had brought her here with nothing but a single bag and a broken heart. Mira listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable as she prepared a simple meal of soup and bread. When Ilara finally fell silent, wiping her face with the back of her hand, Mira set a bowl in front of her and sat down across the table. "The palace physicians declared you barren," Mira repeated slowly, as though testing the weight of the words. "And you felt nothing wrong beforehand. No illness, no pain, nothing unusual at all." "Nothing," Ilara confirmed. "I do not understand it. I trusted them completely. I never thought to question it." Mira's eyes narrowed slightly, though she said nothing more that night. She simply nodded, as though filing the information away for later consideration, and told Ilara to rest. There would be time enough for questions once she had recovered her strength. Ilara slept that night in a small room at the back of the cottage, wrapped in blankets that smelled of dried lavender and wood smoke. For the first time in days, exhaustion outweighed grief, and she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. She did not know that Mira remained awake long after the candles had been extinguished, sitting by the fire with her hands folded thoughtfully in her lap, turning over a suspicion she was not yet ready to voice aloud. She had spent decades treating omegas of every kind, and something about Ilara's story did not sit right with her. A false diagnosis was not unheard of, especially within palace walls where politics often mattered more than truth. But Mira kept her thoughts to herself for now, unwilling to plant hope in a heart so freshly broken, without more certainty to offer. Morning came slowly, sunlight filtering through the small window of Ilara's room, and for a brief, peaceful moment, before full consciousness returned, she forgot everything that had happened. Then the memories rushed back, and with them, the same hollow ache she had felt on the road, settled deep in her stomach, unfamiliar and impossible to ignore. She rose and dressed, moving through the quiet cottage until she found Mira, already awake, grinding herbs at the table with practiced hands. "How do you feel this morning?" Mira asked without looking up. "Tired," Ilara admitted. "And strange. There is an ache in my stomach that I cannot explain. It has been there since I left the palace." Mira's hands stilled. She looked up slowly, studying Ilara's face with an intensity that made Ilara suddenly self-conscious. "What kind of ache?" Mira asked carefully. "I am not certain, not pain exactly, more like pressure, and I have felt tired in a way I have never experienced before, even after resting." Mira set down the herbs she had been grinding and rose from her chair, crossing the small room to stand beside Ilara. She placed a gentle hand against Ilara's forehead, then against the side of her neck, checking for signs of fever or illness with the careful precision of a trained healer. "You do not feel unwell in the way sickness usually presents," Mira murmured, almost to herself. "Tell me, when did your last cycle occur?" Ilara opened her mouth to answer automatically, then paused, genuinely trying to recall. The weeks leading up to her rejection had been consumed by palace duties, by preparations for a formal ceremony that had never taken place, by the slow unraveling of everything she thought she understood about her life. She realized, with a growing sense of unease, that she could not remember. "I am not certain," she admitted slowly. "It has been some time. I assumed the stress of recent events had simply disrupted things." Mira's expression grew thoughtful, though she offered no immediate explanation. Instead, she simply nodded and returned to her seat at the table, though Ilara noticed her hands had grown still, no longer grinding herbs with the same focused rhythm as before. "Rest today," Mira said finally. "Eat well. We will speak more of this later, once you have had time to settle." Ilara agreed, too exhausted and emotionally drained to press further, though the strange sensation in her stomach lingered throughout the day, refusing to be ignored no matter how she tried to distract herself with small tasks around the cottage. She helped Mira sort dried herbs, fetched water from the village well, and tried to convince herself that whatever she was feeling was simply the physical manifestation of grief and exhaustion. But as the days passed and the ache did not fade, and as her exhaustion grew rather than lessened despite ample rest, a small, persistent thought began to take root in the back of her mind, one she was not yet ready to fully acknowledge. What if the physicians had been wrong? The thought terrified her as much as it thrilled her, because if it were true, if there was even the smallest possibility that the diagnosis had been false, then everything that had happened, the rejection, the humiliation, the loss of everything she had built, had been based on a lie. And if it had been a lie, then someone within the palace had orchestrated it deliberately. She thought again of Lord Cassian's satisfied smile, the way his eyes had gleamed with quiet triumph as the physician delivered his verdict. She thought of how quickly Draven had accepted the diagnosis without question, without even granting her the opportunity to speak in her own defense. Alara pressed a hand against her stomach as she stood alone in the small garden behind Mira's cottage, watching the sun sink slowly behind the hills. Whatever was happening within her body, whatever truth was waiting to be uncovered, she knew instinctively that it would change everything. She simply did not yet understand how much. That evening, as the last light faded from the sky, Alara sat by the window of her small room and watched the village settle into its nightly rhythm. Lanterns flickered to life along the narrow streets, and the distant sound of laughter drifted up from a tavern near the river. It was such an ordinary scene, so far removed from the marble halls and gilded ceilings of the palace, and yet Alara found a strange comfort in its simplicity. No one here knew her name. No one here whispered about the rejected Omega who had been cast aside for failing to give the king an heir. For the first time in days, she felt as though she could breathe without the weight of 1,000 watching eyes pressing down on her. But the peace did not last long. A soft knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts, and she turned to see Mira standing in the doorway, a cup of warm tea in her hands. "I thought you might need this," Mira said, stepping inside and setting the cup on the small table beside the bed. "Chamomile and mint. It will help you sleep." Alara accepted the tea gratefully, wrapping her fingers around the warm cup. "Thank you, Mira, for everything. I do not know what I would have done without a place to go." Mira waved off the gratitude with a small shake of her head, though her eyes remained thoughtful as she studied Alara's face in the dim candlelight. "You are family. Even if the connection is distant, blood finds its way home eventually." She paused, then added more carefully, "I have been thinking about what you told me, about the ache, and the exhaustion, and the missing cycle." Alara's grip tightened slightly around the cup. "And what do you think it means?" "I think," Mira said slowly, choosing her words with the caution of someone unwilling to offer false hope, "that there are many possible explanations, and I would rather not speculate until I have more certainty. Grief affects the body in strange ways. Stress can disrupt a cycle entirely. It would be unwise to assume anything without proper examination." "But you do not believe it is only grief," Alara said quietly. It was not a question. Mira's silence was answer enough. She reached out and gently squeezed Alara's hand. "Rest tonight. Tomorrow, if you are willing, I would like to examine you properly. Not the rushed, careless examination the palace physicians likely performed, but a thorough one, with time and attention. If there is something to discover, we will discover it together." Alara nodded, though sleep did not come easily that night. She lay awake long after Mira had left the room, staring at the ceiling while her mind turned over every possibility, every fear, every fragile thread of hope she did not dare to fully embrace. She thought of Draven's cold eyes, the way he had dismissed her without a second glance, the finality in his voice as he severed their bond in front of the entire court. If the diagnosis had been false, if there truly was something growing within her that the physicians had failed to detect, what would that mean for the future? Would Draven even care to know the truth, or had his heart already closed itself off entirely, leaving no room for reconciliation, regardless of what was uncovered? She pressed a hand against her stomach once more, feeling the same strange pressure that had settled there since she left the palace. It did not feel like illness. It did not feel like the physical manifestation of a broken heart. It felt, instead, like something patient and quiet, waiting to be discovered in its own time. Sleep eventually claimed her, though her dreams were filled with fragmented images of golden throne rooms and cold blue eyes, of Lord Cassian's satisfied smile, stretching wider and wider until it consumed the entire hall, of a single scroll sealed with the crown's insignia that seemed to burn in her hands no matter how tightly she tried to hold it steady. She woke before dawn, her heart racing, though the dream faded quickly from memory, leaving behind only a lingering sense of unease. Outside her window, the sky had begun to lighten, streaks of pale gold and rose stretching across the horizon. Alara rose and dressed quietly, careful not to wake Mira, and made her way to the small kitchen, where the embers of last night's fire still glowed faintly in the hearth. She stood there for a long moment, watching the light grow stronger through the window, thinking of everything she had lost, and everything she did not yet understand about what remained. Whatever truth awaited her, whatever answers Mira's examination might reveal, Alara knew that her life had already changed, irrevocably, the moment those palace doors closed behind her. There was no returning to the woman she had been before, the hopeful, trusting Omega, who had believed unquestioningly in the goodness of the man she loved and the fairness of the world around her. That woman was gone, left behind on the long road from the palace to Hollowmere. In her place stood someone harder, someone more determined, someone who would not simply accept whatever verdict was handed to her without demanding proof and understanding for herself. Whatever secret her body was holding, Alara resolved in that quiet moment before dawn, she would uncover it fully, and she would face whatever truth awaited her, with clear eyes and a steady heart, no matter how much it might change everything she thought she knew about her future, and about the kingdom she had once called home. The sun rose fully over Hollowmere, casting warm light across the sleepy village, and somewhere within the walls of the palace she had left behind, King Draven Ashgrove sat alone in his chambers, unable to sleep, unable to explain the strange hollow feeling that had settled into his chest the moment Alara walked out of his life, a feeling he refused to name, refused to examine too closely, though it followed him relentlessly through every waking hour since her departure. Mira's hands moved with practiced precision as she examined Alara in the quiet privacy of the cottage's back room, pressing gently against her stomach, checking her pulse, studying the color of her eyes and the condition of her skin with the focused attention of someone who had spent decades learning to read the body's smallest signals. Alara lay still on the narrow examination table, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain Mira could hear it. "Breathe normally," Mira instructed, noticing the tension in Alara's shoulders. "I cannot get an accurate reading if your body is braced for bad news." Alara forced herself to relax, though it took considerable effort. The morning light filtered through the small window, illuminating dust particles that drifted lazily through the air, a strange contrast to the tension coiled tightly in her chest. Mira worked in silence for several long minutes, occasionally murmuring to herself, occasionally pausing to press more firmly against certain points along Alara's abdomen. Finally, she stepped back, removed her spectacles, and studied Alara's face with an expression that was difficult to read. "I need to ask you something directly," Mira said, "and I need you to answer honestly, without embarrassment or hesitation. When was the last time you and King Draven were intimate, in the way that creates the possibility of a child?" Alara felt heat rush to her face, but she forced herself to think clearly rather than react emotionally. "Perhaps 6 weeks before the diagnosis, we had been careful, since the physicians began preparing for the fertility examinations. But there was one night, shortly before everything changed, when neither of us thought to be careful at all." Mira nodded slowly, as though confirming something she had already suspected. "6 weeks would align with what I am observing. Alara, I want to be very careful in how I say this, because I do not wish to offer false hope if I am wrong. But based on everything I am seeing, and everything you have described, I believe there is a strong possibility that you are pregnant." The words hit Alara like a wave crashing over her, so powerful that she had to grip the edge of the table to steady herself. "That is impossible," she whispered. "The physicians declared me barren. They examined me thoroughly. They were certain." "Physicians can be wrong," Mira said simply, "or they can be pressured into declaring something false, particularly when powerful people benefit from a specific outcome." She paused, watching Alara's face carefully. "I do not say this lightly, Alara, but given everything you have told me about Lord Cassian's satisfaction during the announcement, and given how quickly the king accepted a diagnosis without demanding a second opinion, I find myself deeply suspicious of the circumstances surrounding your rejection." Ilara sat frozen, her mind struggling to process the magnitude of what Mira was suggesting. If she truly was pregnant, if the diagnosis had been falsified, then everything that had happened to her, the public humiliation, the severing of her bond, the loss of her home and her future, had been built entirely on a lie. "How can we know for certain?" Ilara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "There are further signs I can look for as the weeks progress," Mira said. "But I believe, given a little more time, we will have absolute clarity. For now, I would advise patience, and I would strongly advise against telling anyone outside this cottage what we suspect. If someone within the palace deliberately falsified your diagnosis, revealing the truth prematurely could be dangerous, both for you and for the child." The word child settled into the room with a weight that felt almost physical. Ilara pressed both hands against her stomach, and for the first time since the ache had begun, the sensation no longer felt strange or frightening. It felt, instead, like the first fragile thread of something precious, something worth protecting at any cost. "I do not know what to do," Ilara admitted. "If I return to the palace and demand a new examination, Cassian will simply find another way to silence me. If I stay hidden, I risk raising a child alone, without protection, without resources, in a world that has already declared me unfit and cast aside." Mira reached out and took Ilara's hands in hers, her grip firm and reassuring. "You do not need to decide anything today. For now, focus on your health and the health of the child you may be carrying. We will have time to consider your options as things become clearer. But Ilara, I want you to understand something important. Whatever happens, whatever the future holds, you are not alone in this. I will help you in whatever way I can." Tears welled in Ilara's eyes, though this time they were not born entirely of grief. There was something else mixed within them now, something fragile and cautious, but undeniably present: hope. The following weeks passed in a strange blend of anxious waiting and quiet routine. Ilara helped Mira with her daily work, tending the small garden of medicinal herbs behind the cottage, assisting with the occasional village resident who came seeking treatment for minor ailments. The physical labor kept her mind occupied, though the ache in her stomach continued to grow, along with an exhaustion that seemed to deepen with each passing day. By the 4th week since her arrival in Hollowmere, there was no longer any doubt. Mira confirmed what both of them had already suspected in their hearts. Ilara was carrying a child, conceived during that single unguarded night before the false diagnosis had torn her life apart. "There is something else," Mira said carefully, during a particularly thorough examination one quiet afternoon. "Something I want to prepare you for, though I do not wish to alarm you unnecessarily." Ilara's stomach tightened with fresh anxiety. "What is it?" "The way your body has developed over these past weeks, the rate of change, the particular pattern of growth I am observing, suggests to me that you may be carrying more than one child." Ilara stared at her, uncertain she had heard correctly. "Twins?" "It is only a suspicion at this stage," Mira said quickly. "But given that the king is an alpha, and given the strength of the bond you once shared, it would not be entirely unprecedented. Alpha bloodlines, particularly royal ones, occasionally produce multiple offspring in a single pregnancy. It happens rarely, but it does happen." The possibility settled over Ilara with dizzying weight. Not one child, but potentially 2, carried in secret, hidden away from a kingdom that had already declared her incapable of bearing children at all. The irony was almost too much to bear. As the weeks turned into months, Ilara's body continued to change, and with each passing day, the truth became more difficult to conceal. Mira insisted on keeping her hidden within the cottage as much as possible, wary of curious villagers who might notice the changes and begin to talk. Hollowmere was a small community, and news, even news as seemingly insignificant as a visiting relative's changing appearance, had a way of traveling faster than anyone anticipated. Ilara spent long hours in quiet reflection during this period, turning over the events that had led her here again and again in her mind. She thought of Draven constantly, despite her best efforts to push him from her thoughts. She remembered the way he used to look at her before everything changed, the warmth in his eyes, the gentleness in his voice when they were alone together, away from the pressures of court and politics. It was difficult to reconcile that man with the cold, distant king who had rejected her without a second glance, who had accepted a false diagnosis without demanding proof, who had allowed her to be cast out of the only home she had known. And yet, despite everything, despite the anger and hurt that still lived within her, Elara found herself wondering whether Draven truly believed the diagnosis, or whether he had been manipulated as thoroughly as she had. She remembered Lord Cassian's satisfied expression, the calculated coldness in his eyes, that had never quite matched simple political disagreement. If Cassian had orchestrated the false diagnosis, it was entirely possible that he had also manipulated Draven's response, perhaps through pressure from the council, perhaps through fabricated evidence, designed to make rejection seem like the only reasonable course of action. She did not know, and without returning to the palace, she had no way of finding out. For now, her priority had to be the safety of the children growing within her, children who represented not only her future, but potentially a direct threat to whatever plans Lord Cassian had set into motion. One evening, as autumn began to settle over Hollowmere and the leaves along the riverbank turned brilliant shades of orange and red, Mira found Elara sitting quietly in the garden, her hands resting protectively over her rounding stomach, watching the sunset paint the sky in soft, fading colors. "You look troubled," Mira observed, settling onto the bench beside her. "I am thinking about the future," Elara admitted. "About what happens when the children are born, when it becomes impossible to hide the truth any longer. Hollowmere is peaceful, but it is not equipped to protect royal heirs from those who might wish them harm, especially if Lord Cassian discovers they exist." Mira nodded thoughtfully. "You are right to be concerned. We will need a plan, one that ensures your safety and the safety of your children, regardless of how the political situation in the capital unfolds. But Elara, I want you to trust that we still have time. The children are not due for several more months. We will use that time wisely." Elara leaned her head against Mira's shoulder, grateful beyond words for the older woman's steady presence throughout everything that had happened. "Thank you, Mira. I do not know how I would have survived any of this without you." "You are stronger than you realize," Mira said softly. "Stronger than the palace ever gave you credit for. Whatever happens in the months ahead, I believe you will find the strength to protect what matters most." As darkness settled fully over Hollowmere, Elara remained in the garden a while longer, watching the first stars emerge in the deepening sky, her hands still resting protectively over the life growing within her. Far away, within the golden walls of the palace she had once called home, King Draven Ashgrove stood alone on his balcony, staring out at the same darkening sky, haunted by a restlessness he could not name, unaware that the woman he had cast aside was carrying a secret that would eventually shake the very foundation of everything he believed to be true. Inside the palace, life continued as though nothing had changed, though Draven noticed the subtle shifts in the way people looked at him now, the careful distance the court maintained, the whispered conversations that fell silent whenever he entered a room. He told himself he did not care what the nobles thought of his decision. He told himself the rejection had been necessary, a matter of duty rather than desire. But the words felt hollow even in the privacy of his own mind, and no amount of repetition made them feel any truer. Lord Cassian had become a near constant presence at his side in the weeks since Elara's departure, offering counsel on matters of state, suggesting potential matches among the daughters of allied houses, steering conversations toward the future of the kingdom, with a persistence that Draven found increasingly difficult to ignore. At first he had welcomed his cousin's guidance, grateful for someone willing to help shoulder the burden of leadership during a difficult time. But lately, something about Cassian's eagerness had begun to feel less like genuine concern and more like calculated opportunity. "The Duke of Ashfell has a daughter of marriageable age," Cassian said one evening, as the two men sat together in the king's private study, a fire crackling in the hearth between them. "Her bloodline is strong, and the alliance would strengthen our position along the eastern border considerably." Draven stared into the flames without responding, his mind elsewhere entirely. "I am not ready to discuss a new match, Cassian. With respect, cousin, the kingdom cannot afford unnecessary delay. An heir is essential, and the sooner a suitable match is arranged, the sooner stability can be restored to the succession." "I am aware of the kingdom's needs," Draven said, his voice sharper than he intended. "I do not require reminding." Cassian raised his hands in a gesture of surrender, though the small, satisfied curve of his lips did not entirely fade. "Of course. I only wish to help ease your burdens during this difficult transition." Draven studied his cousin for a long moment, something uneasy, stirring in his chest, that he could not quite articulate. There was nothing overtly suspicious in Cassian's words, nothing he could point to directly as evidence of ill intent, and yet the persistent unease remained, growing stronger each time the topic of remarriage arose. After Cassian left the study that evening, Draven remained alone by the fire, turning over the events of the past weeks in his mind. He thought of the physician's report, the clinical certainty with which the diagnosis had been delivered, the complete absence of hesitation or doubt in the man's voice. At the time, Draven had accepted it without question, trusting the palace physicians, as he had always trusted them, never once considering that such a report could be manipulated or falsified for political gain. But now, in the quiet solitude of his study, doubt began to creep into his thoughts, small and persistent, refusing to be dismissed entirely. He remembered the way Alara had looked at him in that final moment before the guards led her away, the desperate plea in her eyes, the way she had called his name, as though begging him to see past the physician's words to the truth she alone seemed to understand. He had turned away from that look, told himself it was simply the pain of rejection speaking, nothing more. But what if she had been trying to tell him something else entirely? He rose from his chair and walked to the window, staring out at the darkened gardens below, the same gardens where he and Alara had once walked together during quieter, happier times. The ache of her absence had not lessened in the weeks since her departure, despite his attempts to bury himself in the responsibilities of leadership. If anything, it had grown sharper, more insistent, a constant reminder of a decision he was no longer entirely certain had been the right one. He thought of summoning the physician again, demanding a more thorough explanation of the examination process, questioning whether proper protocols had been followed. But something held him back, a nagging awareness that doing so might draw unwanted attention to doubts he was not yet ready to voice publicly. If his suspicions proved unfounded, he would only succeed in appearing weak and indecisive before a court already unsettled by the sudden rejection of his mate. And if his suspicions proved true, he was not certain he was prepared to confront the implications, the possibility that his own cousin had orchestrated a deception of such magnitude, or that he himself had failed the woman he loved so completely and so publicly. Draven closed his eyes, exhaustion settling heavily over him. Sleep had become increasingly elusive since Alara's departure, his nights filled with restless turning and half-formed dreams he could never quite remember upon waking, save for a lingering sense of loss that followed him into each new day. Far from the palace, in the quiet safety of Mira's cottage, Alara knew nothing of the doubts beginning to stir within the man who had once been her mate. She knew only the steady rhythm of her new life in Hollowmere, the comfort of Mira's presence, and the growing certainty within her own body that something precious and unexpected was taking shape, something that no false diagnosis could erase or deny. As the weeks progressed, and her pregnancy became more difficult to conceal beneath loose clothing and careful positioning, Alara began to venture out less frequently, spending most of her days within the cottage or the small enclosed garden behind it, safely hidden from curious eyes. Mira continued her careful observations, monitoring the pregnancy with the same attentive care she gave to every patient who came to her for treatment, though Alara knew this particular case carried stakes far higher than any other Mira had likely encountered in her long career as a village healer. "You should consider names," Mira suggested one quiet evening, as the two women sat together near the fire, a light rain pattering softly against the cottage windows. "It might help to think of the future in practical terms, rather than only in terms of danger and uncertainty." Alara managed a small smile at the suggestion, the first genuine smile Mira had seen from her in weeks. "I have not allowed myself to think that far ahead. It felt too dangerous, somehow, to hope for a future I was not certain would be safe to claim." "Hope is not dangerous," Mira said gently. "It is necessary, especially now, when you carry not only your own future within you, but the future of two innocent lives, who deserve every chance at safety and happiness, regardless of the circumstances of their conception, or the politics surrounding their birth." Alara rested her hands against her rounding stomach, feeling, for the first time in a long while, a genuine flicker of warmth beneath the persistent anxiety that had shadowed her since leaving the palace. Mira was right. Whatever dangers lay ahead, whatever uncertainty the future held, the children growing within her deserved more than fear and hesitation from their mother. They deserved hope, and they deserved a mother willing to fight for their safety with everything she possessed. Perhaps, Elara said softly, it is time I began to think of the future after all. Outside, the rain continued to fall gently over Hollowmere, washing the village in a soft, steady rhythm that felt, for the first time in a long while, like the beginning of something new rather than merely the continuation of loss. A sharp cry pierced the quiet of the cottage as Elara doubled over, one hand gripping the edge of the kitchen table, the other pressed hard against her stomach. Mira dropped the basket of herbs she had been carrying and rushed to her side, catching her before her knees could buckle completely. Breathe, Mira said firmly, guiding Elara to a chair. Slow, steady breaths. Tell me what you are feeling. A sharp pain, Elara gasped. Here, on my right side. It came suddenly, without warning. Mira's face grew serious as she knelt beside the chair, pressing careful fingers against the area Elara indicated. The pregnancy had progressed well into its 6th month, and complications, though not unexpected given the rarity of the circumstances, were exactly what Mira had feared most since confirming that Elara was likely carrying twins. I need you to lie down, Mira said, helping her toward the small bed in the back room. I am going to examine you thoroughly, and I need you to remain as calm as possible, no matter what I find. Elara nodded, though fear had already begun to tighten around her chest like a fist. She lay still while Mira worked, monitoring her pulse, checking the position and movement of the children, listening carefully for any sign of distress. The examination stretched on for what felt like an eternity, though in reality, it lasted only a matter of minutes. Finally, Mira sat back, her expression a careful mixture of relief and continued concern. The children are stable for now, but Elara, I must be honest with you. Carrying twins is difficult under the best circumstances, and carrying the children of an Alpha King, particularly without the medical resources available within the palace, presents risks I am not fully equipped to manage on my own. What kind of risks? Elara asked, her voice trembling despite her effort to remain composed. The strain on your body is considerable, and it will only increase as the pregnancy progresses. There is a possibility of complications during birth that would require more advanced medical intervention than I can provide here in Hollowmere. I am a skilled healer, Elara, but I am not equipped for the kind of emergency care that royal physicians train for specifically. Mira paused, choosing her next words carefully. I believe, for the safety of both you and the children, that you may eventually need access to the kind of medical care only available within the palace. The suggestion hit Elara like a physical blow. You are asking me to return to the place that rejected me, to the man who cast me aside without a second thought. I am not asking you to do anything, Mira said gently. I am simply telling you what I believe to be true, based on my professional assessment of the risks involved. The decision remains entirely yours, but I would be failing in my duty to you if I did not share my honest concerns. Elara closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the impossible weight of the choice now facing her. Returning to the palace meant confronting Draven again, confronting Lord Cassian, confronting the very people who had orchestrated her downfall in the first place. It meant risking everything, her safety, her freedom, and potentially the safety of her children, all in pursuit of medical care that might ultimately prove unnecessary. But staying in Hollowmere meant risking something equally terrible, the possibility that when the moment finally came, Mira's skills alone would not be enough to protect the lives of the children Elara had already come to love with a fierce and unwavering devotion, despite the uncertainty and danger surrounding their existence. I need time to think, Elara said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. You have time, Mira assured her. The pain you experience today does not indicate immediate danger, but I would encourage you not to wait too long before deciding. As the pregnancy progresses, our options will narrow considerably. Elara spent the following days in quiet, anxious contemplation, turning the decision over endlessly in her mind. She thought of Draven's cold rejection, the way he had refused to even look at her as the guards led her from the hall. She thought of Lord Cassian's satisfied smile, and the very real possibility that returning to the palace would mean placing herself and her children directly within his reach, vulnerable to whatever plans he had already set into motion. And yet, she also thought of the alternative, of laboring alone in a small village cottage, far from the resources that could mean the difference between life and death for her children should complications arise. The weight of that possibility outweighed even her deepest fears about confronting Draven again. One evening, nearly a week after the frightening episode of pain, Ilara found Mira in the garden, tending to the last of the season's herbs before the coming frost claimed them entirely. She approached slowly, her decision finally settled within her heart, though the weight of it still pressed heavily against her chest. "I have decided," Ilara said. "I will need to find a way to access proper medical care, even if it means eventually revealing myself to people connected to the palace. But I will not simply walk back through those front gates and place myself entirely at the mercy of a man who rejected me and a court that condemned me, without hesitation." Mira looked up from her work, studying Ilara's face carefully. "What are you proposing instead?" "I do not know yet," Ilara admitted, "but I believe there must be a way to seek help without fully surrendering myself to danger. Perhaps a physician outside the palace's direct influence, someone with the necessary skill but without loyalty to Lord Cassian or the political games of the court." Mira considered this for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "There is someone I know, a physician named Corwin, who once trained within the palace itself, before choosing to practice independently in a town further east. He left under circumstances that were never fully explained to me, but I have always believed there was some disagreement with the palace's medical establishment. He might be willing to help, and his training would make him far more capable than I am of managing complications should they arise." A small flicker of hope stirred within Ilara at the suggestion. "Do you believe he could be trusted?" "I believe so," Mira said, "but I would want to speak with him myself first, to gauge his willingness and ensure his discretion, before bringing you into direct contact with him. It would mean a journey of several days, and given your current condition, that journey carries its own risks." Ilara nodded, understanding the gravity of what Mira was proposing. "Whatever risks are involved, I believe it is worth pursuing. I cannot simply wait and hope that nothing goes wrong. I owe it to my children to seek out every possible advantage for their safety." Mira reached out and squeezed Ilara's hand firmly. "Then I will leave within the next few days to speak with Corwin directly. In the meantime, you must rest as much as possible and avoid any unnecessary strain. I do not wish to return and find that complications have arisen in my absence." The following days passed in tense anticipation as Mira prepared for her journey, gathering supplies and making arrangements with a trusted neighbor to check on Ilara periodically while she was away. Ilara spent the time trying to distract herself with small tasks around the cottage, though her mind remained constantly occupied with worry, both for the physical dangers facing her pregnancy and for the larger, more complicated dangers still lurking within the political world she had left behind. On the morning of Mira's departure, the two women stood together at the cottage gate, the early autumn air crisp and cool around them. "Be careful," Ilara said, embracing Mira tightly, "and thank you, again, for everything you have done for me. I do not know how I will ever repay this kindness." "You owe me nothing," Mira said firmly. "Family cares for family, regardless of distance or circumstance. I will return as quickly as I can, hopefully with good news." Ilara watched until Mira's figure disappeared over the distant hill, then turned back toward the cottage, suddenly aware of how isolated and vulnerable she felt without Mira's steady presence beside her. The days that followed passed slowly, marked by careful routine and quiet worry, as Ilara counted down the time until Mira's expected return. On the fourth day of Mira's absence, as Ilara sat in the garden attempting to distract herself with mending a torn piece of clothing, she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching from the direction of the village road, far earlier than she had anticipated. Her heart leapt with hope that Mira had returned ahead of schedule, but as the rider drew closer, she realized with a jolt of fear that the figure approaching was not Mira at all. A man dressed in traveling clothes, unfamiliar, and clearly not from Hollowmere, dismounted near the cottage gate and glanced around with the careful, assessing gaze of someone searching for something specific. Ilara froze, her instincts screaming at her to hide, though it was already too late. The stranger's eyes fell upon her, widening slightly with what looked like recognition. "Forgive the intrusion," the man said, his voice carrying a careful, measured tone that did nothing to ease Ilara's mounting alarm. "I am searching for a healer named Mira. I was told she resides in this village." Ilara's mind raced, trying to determine whether this man posed a genuine threat or was simply a traveler seeking legitimate medical assistance. His clothing, though practical, bore subtle markings that suggested some connection to the capital, a detail that only heightened her unease. "She is not here at present," Ilara said carefully, keeping her expression neutral despite the fear coiling tightly in her chest. "I do not know when she will return." The stranger studied her for a long moment, his gaze lingering on the rounded shape of her stomach beneath her cloak, and something in his expression shifted, a flicker of calculation that Ilara did not like at all. "My apologies for troubling you," he said finally, though his tone had grown noticeably more careful. "I will return another time." He mounted his horse and rode away without further explanation, leaving Ilara standing alone in the garden, her heart pounding with a fear she could not fully rationalize. Something about the encounter felt deeply wrong, though she could not pinpoint exactly why. She hurried inside the cottage and secured the door, her mind racing through every possible implication of the stranger's visit. Had he been sent by Lord Cassian, searching for any sign of her whereabouts? Had her location somehow been discovered, despite the careful secrecy she and Mira had maintained since her arrival in Hollowmere? Or was she simply allowing fear and exhaustion to color an entirely innocent encounter with sinister implications that did not actually exist? She spent the remainder of the day in a state of anxious vigilance, watching the road from the cottage window for any further sign of the stranger's return, or worse, for a larger group that might indicate a more organized search. By nightfall, when no further visitors had appeared, she allowed herself a small measure of relief, though sleep remained elusive, as she turned over every detail of the encounter again and again in her mind. Mira returned 2 days later than originally planned, looking exhausted from her journey, but carrying news that brought a cautious flicker of hope to Ilara's anxious heart. Corwin, the physician she had sought out, had agreed to help, moved by the injustice of Ilara's situation and his own long-standing distrust of the palace's medical establishment following his departure years earlier. But when Ilara relayed the details of the stranger's visit during Mira's absence, the healer's expression grew grave with concern. "We must be more careful," Mira said firmly. "If someone connected to the palace is indeed searching for you, our time here in Hollowmere may be more limited than we hoped. We will need to move forward with caution, and perhaps sooner than originally planned." Ilara nodded, pressing a protective hand against her stomach, as a fresh wave of determination settled over her, replacing some of the fear that had gripped her since the stranger's unexpected arrival. Whatever dangers lay ahead, whatever forces were beginning to close in around her, she would not allow fear to paralyze her into inaction. Her children's safety depended on her strength and resolve, and she intended to summon every ounce of both in the difficult days that surely lay ahead. Far to the west, within the capital, Lord Cassian sat in his private study, reviewing a letter that had arrived earlier that morning, his expression unreadable in the flickering candlelight. The letter was brief, written in a careful, deliberately vague hand, but its message was clear enough to send a cold ripple of alarm through him. A traveler matching the description of one of his own hired men had visited a village called Hollowmere and encountered a pregnant woman residing with a local healer, a woman whose description bore an uncomfortable resemblance to Ilara Voss. Cassian set the letter down and pressed his fingers against his temples, his mind racing through the implications. He had been so certain, so thoroughly confident in the physician he had bribed to falsify the diagnosis, that the possibility of Ilara's pregnancy had never seriously entered his calculations. If she was indeed carrying a child, and if that child belonged to Draven, then everything he had worked to achieve over the past several months stood at risk of complete collapse. He rose from his desk and crossed to the window, staring out at the darkened gardens below, turning the problem over carefully in his mind. If word of Ilara's pregnancy reached Draven before Cassian could intervene, the king would undoubtedly seek to reclaim her, and the truth of the falsified diagnosis would almost certainly come to light in the process. Such an outcome would not only ruin Cassian's carefully constructed plans for his own daughter's eventual rise to power, but could very well result in severe punishment for the deception itself, a treasonous act against the crown that carried consequences far more serious than simple political embarrassment. He needed to act quickly and decisively, before the situation spiraled entirely beyond his control. A knock at his study door interrupted his thoughts, and he called for the visitor to enter, quickly composing his expression into something more neutral, before turning to face whoever had arrived. It was Renwick, one of the few men within the palace whose loyalty to Cassian ran deeper than his loyalty to the crown itself. A former guard captain who had been quietly dismissed from royal service years earlier, under circumstances that remained his own carefully guarded secret. "You sent for me, my lord?" Renwick asked, closing the door behind him. "I have a task that requires absolute discretion," Cassian said, returning to his desk and gesturing for Renwick to sit. "There is a matter in a village called Hollowmere that requires immediate attention. A woman is residing there, hidden away with a local healer, and I need to know with certainty whether she poses a threat to certain arrangements I have made." Renwick's expression remained carefully neutral, though his eyes sharpened with interest. "What kind of threat, my lord?" Cassian hesitated, weighing how much information to share even with a man as loyal as Renwick. "It is possible this woman is carrying a child that could complicate the succession considerably. I need you to travel to Hollowmere, confirm whether this is true, and if it is, I need you to ensure the situation is handled quietly, before word can reach the palace through any other channel." "Handled how, my lord?" Renwick asked carefully. "I will leave the specifics to your judgment," Cassian said, his voice cold and deliberate. "But understand this clearly. If this woman's condition becomes public knowledge before I am prepared to address it on my own terms, the consequences for both of us will be severe. I trust you understand the importance of discretion in this matter." Renwick nodded slowly, understanding the implicit weight behind Cassian's carefully chosen words, though neither man spoke the darker implications aloud. "I will leave within the hour, my lord. You will have word from me within the week." After Renwick departed, Cassian remained alone in his study for a long while, staring into the dying embers of the fire, trying to convince himself that the actions he had set into motion were necessary, justified by the greater good of maintaining stability within the kingdom. He told himself that Alara had never truly belonged among the nobility, that her removal from the succession, however it was ultimately achieved, served the kingdom's best interests, far better than allowing an outsider's child to inherit the throne. But even as he repeated these justifications to himself, a small, persistent unease continued to gnaw at the edges of his conscience, a growing awareness that he had crossed a line from political maneuvering into something considerably darker, something from which there might be no clean or honorable return. Meanwhile, within his own chambers on the opposite side of the palace, King Draven Ashgrove remained similarly restless, unable to shake the persistent doubt that had settled over him in recent weeks regarding the circumstances of Alara's rejection. He had begun making quiet inquiries of his own, careful not to draw undue attention, speaking casually with members of the court about the physician who had delivered the original diagnosis, gathering small fragments of information that, taken individually, meant little, but which together were beginning to paint a troubling picture. He learned, through careful conversation with a trusted advisor, that the physician in question had recently acquired a substantial property near the eastern border, an acquisition that seemed considerably beyond what his modest palace salary should have afforded. He learned also that Lord Cassian had been seen meeting privately with the same physician on several occasions in the weeks leading up to Alara's examination, meetings that had never been disclosed through official channels. Individually, these details proved nothing definitive. But combined with the persistent ache of doubt that had lodged itself in Draven's chest since the day Alara walked out of his life, they were enough to convince him that a more thorough investigation was warranted, regardless of the political complications such an investigation might create. He resolved, in the quiet solitude of his chambers, that he would find a way to speak directly with the physician who had delivered the diagnosis, away from the watchful eyes of the court, and away from any opportunity for Cassian to interfere or influence the conversation. If his suspicions proved correct, if Alara's rejection had truly been built upon a foundation of lies and manipulation, he intended to uncover the full truth, regardless of the cost to his own pride, or his cousin's carefully cultivated reputation within the court. The path forward remained uncertain, fraught with political danger and the very real possibility of discovering betrayal from someone he had trusted his entire life. But Draven found that uncertainty preferable to the alternative, to continuing forward under the assumption that his rejection of Alara had been justified, when every instinct within him now screamed that something had gone terribly, irreversibly wrong. Back in Hollowmere, 3 days after Mira's return from her journey to find Corwin, Alara stood at the cottage window watching the evening light fade over the hills, a quiet unease settling over her that she could not fully explain. The strange visitor who had come searching for Mira remained fixed in her thoughts, his careful, calculating gaze replaying in her mind whenever she allowed herself a quiet moment of reflection. "You are troubled again," Mira observed, joining her at the window with a cup of warm broth in hand. "I cannot shake the feeling that we are running out of time," Ilara admitted, accepting the cup gratefully. "The man who came here, asking for you specifically, by name. It felt deliberate, Mira, not the casual inquiry of a traveler seeking a healer's services." Mira's expression grew thoughtful. "I have wondered the same thing myself, though I did not wish to add to your worries unnecessarily. Perhaps it is time we consider relocating you somewhere less easily discovered, at least until Corwin is prepared to receive you safely. I have no connections beyond this village, no resources of my own, nothing but the small bag of belongings I carried with me the night I left the palace. There is a small farmstead 2 days' journey from here, owned by a widow I have known for many years," Mira said. "She would take you in without question, and the location is far enough removed from any main road that it would be considerably more difficult for anyone to find you by chance." Ilara considered this carefully, weighing the exhaustion and risk of another journey against the growing danger of remaining in a place that had already attracted unwanted attention. Her hand drifted instinctively to her rounded stomach, feeling the small, reassuring movements of the children within, a reminder of exactly what she stood to lose should her caution prove insufficient. "Perhaps it would be wise to prepare for such a journey," she said finally, "even if we do not depart immediately. I would rather be ready to move quickly than caught unprepared should the need arise suddenly." Mira nodded in agreement, already turning her mind toward practical matters, cataloging supplies, and considering the logistics of transporting a heavily pregnant woman safely across the countryside, should the situation demand it. The two women spent the remainder of the evening in quiet preparation, packing a small emergency bag of essential supplies and medicines, speaking in hushed tones about contingency plans should danger arrive without warning. Neither of them could have known, as they worked together by candlelight in the quiet safety of the cottage, that Renwick had already arrived in the region, staying at a modest inn in a neighboring town, while he made careful, methodical inquiries about a healer named Mira and a mysterious pregnant woman who had recently taken up residence in her home. He moved with practiced caution, never asking direct questions that might arouse suspicion, instead gathering information through casual conversation with innkeepers, merchants, and travelers passing through the area. By the following morning, he had gathered enough scattered details to feel confident he had located the correct village, and he began making plans to approach Hollowmere directly, his mind already turning toward the darker possibilities Lord Cassian had left unspoken, but clearly implied during their conversation in the palace study. Whatever measures ultimately proved necessary to protect his employer's interests, Renwick had long ago learned not to question the morality of his assignments too closely, focusing instead on the considerable reward that awaited successful completion of whatever task he had been given. As dawn broke over Hollowmere the next morning, casting long shadows across the quiet village streets, neither Ilara nor Mira yet suspected how close the danger had already drawn, nor how quickly the fragile peace they had built together within the cottage walls was about to be shattered entirely. A fist pounded against the cottage door with such force that the wood shuddered in its frame, jolting Ilara awake from a light, uneasy sleep. She sat up quickly, her heart hammering, and heard Mira's hurried footsteps crossing the main room toward the door. "Who is there?" Mira called, her voice carrying a firmness that did not fully mask the tension underneath. "I am seeking shelter for the night," came a man's voice from the other side, calm and measured, though something in its tone sent a cold shiver down Ilara's spine. "My horse has gone lame, and I find myself stranded without lodging." Ilara rose carefully from the bed, moving to the small gap in her bedroom door, where she could observe the main room without being seen. Mira hesitated at the entrance, clearly torn between the village custom of offering shelter to travelers in need and some instinctive wariness that Ilara could see reflected in the healer's tense posture. "There is an inn in the village center," Mira said. "It would suit you better than my humble cottage." "I attempted the inn already," the voice replied. "They have no rooms available tonight. I would be most grateful for even a small corner to rest until morning." Ilara's pulse quickened. Something about the persistence in the stranger's voice, the calm, unwavering patience, felt calculated rather than genuine. She thought immediately of the earlier visitor who had come searching for Mira by name, and dread settled heavily in her stomach. Mira glanced back toward Alara's door, and though no words passed between them, Alara understood the silent communication perfectly. Mira could not refuse the man entirely, without arousing further suspicion, but neither of them believed his story to be entirely truthful. "Very well," Mira said finally, opening the door just enough to allow the stranger into the front room, though she positioned herself carefully to block his view deeper into the cottage. "You may rest by the fire until dawn. I ask that you keep to this room only." The man who entered was tall, with sharp, assessing eyes that swept quickly across the cottage interior, despite his outwardly polite demeanor. Alara recognized him immediately, though she had never seen his face before, simply by the predatory quality of his gaze, so similar to the calculating look Lord Cassian had worn the day her rejection was announced. "You are most kind," the man said, settling near the fire with deliberate casualness. "I am called Renwick. I have traveled some distance seeking a healer of considerable skill. Perhaps you might know of one in this region." "There are several healers throughout these villages," Mira said carefully, remaining near the doorway rather than settling into the room herself. "I could not say which one might suit your particular needs without knowing more of your situation." Renwick's eyes flicked briefly toward the hallway leading to the back rooms, and Alara, watching through the narrow gap in her door, felt certain he had somehow sensed her presence, though she remained perfectly still and silent. "I seek a healer named Mira, specifically," Renwick said, his tone carrying a subtle edge beneath its surface politeness. "I was told she resides somewhere in this village, and that she recently took in a guest of some significance." The room fell silent. Alara's heart pounded so loudly she feared it might be audible even from her hiding place. Mira's expression did not change, though Alara could see the tension coiled tightly in her shoulders. "I am not aware of any such healer," Mira said evenly. "Perhaps you were misinformed." Renwick studied her for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression, a subtle hardening that confirmed every fear Alara had been harboring since his arrival. "I do not believe I was misinformed at all," he said quietly. "I believe I am speaking with her directly, and I believe her guest is listening to this very conversation from somewhere just beyond that hallway." Alara's blood ran cold. There was no more pretense left to maintain. Renwick rose slowly from his seat near the fire, his casual demeanor entirely abandoned, replaced by something far more dangerous and direct. "I have no wish to cause unnecessary harm," he said, addressing the hallway directly now, knowing full well that Alara could hear every word. "But I have been sent to confirm certain information, and I intend to complete my task regardless of how much cooperation is offered willingly." Alara's mind raced through every possible option, her hand instinctively moving to protect the rounded curve of her stomach. There was no back exit from the small room she occupied, no way to escape without passing directly through the main room where Renwick now stood. Mira, without warning, seized a heavy iron poker from beside the fireplace and swung it with surprising force, catching Renwick off guard as he took a step toward the hallway. The blow struck his shoulder rather than the head she had likely aimed for, but it was enough to send him stumbling backward, giving Alara the precious seconds she desperately needed. "Run," Mira shouted, already positioning herself between Renwick and the hallway. "Through the garden, to the widow's farmstead. I will follow when I can." Alara did not hesitate. She grabbed the small emergency bag they had prepared days earlier and fled through the back door of the cottage into the cold night air, her heart pounding with a fear more intense than anything she had experienced since the day of her rejection. Behind her, she heard the sounds of struggle, Mira's furious shouting, and Renwick's low, angry voice demanding she reveal Alara's location. She ran as quickly as her advanced pregnancy allowed, stumbling through the dark garden and into the tree line beyond, guided only by the faint memory of directions Mira had once described toward the distant farmstead. Branches caught at her cloak, and the uneven ground threatened to send her tumbling with every hurried step, but she forced herself forward, driven by pure, desperate instinct to protect the children she carried. Behind her, the sounds of struggle faded into the distance, replaced by an ominous silence that filled her with even greater dread. She did not know whether Mira had managed to fend off Renwick entirely, or whether he had subdued her and was now pursuing Alara through the darkness. She pressed forward, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her legs burning with exhaustion and strain, The forest around her seemed to stretch endlessly, shadows shifting unpredictably in the pale moonlight filtering through the canopy above. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves, sent fresh waves of terror through her, though she forced herself not to stop, not to look back, focusing entirely on the singular goal of putting as much distance as possible between herself and the danger she had left behind. After what felt like hours but was likely closer to 30 minutes, Ilara finally emerged from the tree line into a small clearing, and in the distance, she could make out the faint outline of a modest farmhouse, a single lantern burning in one window despite the late hour. Relief flooded through her, though it was tempered by exhaustion so complete she could barely remain standing. She stumbled toward the farmhouse, her legs threatening to give out entirely with each remaining step, and collapsed against the front door just as it opened, revealing an elderly woman with sharp, kind eyes, who caught her before she could fall completely to the ground. "Mira sent me," Ilara managed to gasp out, her voice barely audible. "Please, I need help." The widow, recognizing the desperate urgency in Ilara's voice and the clearly advanced state of her pregnancy, wasted no time with unnecessary questions. She guided Ilara inside quickly, securing the door behind them, and helped her to a chair near the fire. "You are safe here for now," the widow said firmly. "My name is Rosalind. Mira has spoken of you, though she gave few details. Tell me quickly, what has happened?" Between labored breaths, Ilara relayed the events of the night, the sudden arrival of Renwick, his thinly veiled threats, Mira's desperate intervention that had allowed her the chance to escape. Rosalind listened with grave attention, her expression growing increasingly concerned as the story unfolded. "We must assume this man may still be searching for you," Rosalind said once Ilara finished. "I will secure the house as best I can, but we should prepare for the possibility that he may locate this farmstead eventually, particularly if he questions villagers along the route you traveled." Ilara nodded, exhaustion and fear warring within her, though beneath both emotions, a fierce determination remained steady and unshaken. She had escaped once already tonight. Whatever dangers still lay ahead, she would not allow herself to be caught unprepared again. "Is there any word of Mira?" Ilara asked anxiously. "I do not know what happened to her after I fled." "I have no way of knowing yet," Rosalind admitted gently. "But Mira is a resourceful woman, and she has faced difficult situations before. We must trust in her strength for now, and focus on ensuring your own safety and that of your children." As the fire crackled softly in the hearth, and the first hints of dawn began to creep across the horizon outside, Ilara allowed herself, finally, to rest, though sleep remained distant and elusive. Her mind continued to race through the events of the night, through fear for Mira's safety, through growing certainty that the danger surrounding her had escalated far beyond anything she had initially anticipated when she first arrived in Hollowmere, seeking nothing more than quiet refuge from a broken heart. Whatever came next, she understood now with absolute clarity that hiding alone would no longer be enough to protect the children growing within her. Some decisive action would eventually be required, though what that action might be, and what price it would ultimately demand, remained entirely uncertain as the pale light of morning finally broke over the unfamiliar farmstead that had become her latest, fragile refuge. Mira arrived at the farmstead shortly before noon, limping slightly and bearing a bruise along her jaw, but otherwise unharmed. Ilara rushed to embrace her the moment she appeared at the door, relief flooding through her so powerfully that tears sprang immediately to her eyes. "You are safe," Ilara said, holding on to her tightly. "I feared the worst when I heard nothing." "I am tougher than I look," Mira said, managing a tired smile despite her obvious exhaustion. "Renwick was persistent, but I convinced him that pursuing you further into unfamiliar woods at night would be foolish, and that he was more likely to injure himself than find you before daylight. He left, though I suspect only temporarily. He will return with reinforcements once he reports back to whoever sent him." Ilara's stomach tightened at the confirmation of what she had already suspected. "Lord Cassian." "Almost certainly," Mira agreed, settling into a chair near the fire, while Rosalind brought her a cup of warm tea, "which means our situation has grown considerably more dangerous. If Cassian is willing to send men after you directly, it confirms beyond doubt that the diagnosis was falsified deliberately, and that he views your pregnancy as a genuine threat to whatever plans he has been pursuing." "What do we do now?" Ilara asked, sinking into the chair beside her. exhaustion and fear settling heavily over her once again. Mira exchanged a glance with Rosalind before answering. I believe our original plan, seeking Corwin's medical assistance, remains sound, but we will need to proceed with far greater caution than before. We cannot risk staying in any single location for long, not with Cassian's men actively searching for you. Perhaps, Rosalind offered carefully, it is time to consider a more drastic solution. If this man Renwick works for Lord Cassian, and if his mission was sanctioned at the highest levels, then hiding indefinitely may not be a sustainable strategy. Eventually, they will find you, no matter how many times you relocate. Ilara's hand moved instinctively to her stomach, feeling the reassuring movement of the children within, and something hardened within her resolve. What are you suggesting? I am suggesting, Rosalind said carefully, that perhaps the safest path forward is not further concealment, but exposure. If the truth of your pregnancy, and the truth of the falsified diagnosis, were to reach ears beyond Lord Cassian's control, particularly ears sympathetic to your cause, it might remove the incentive for him to pursue you at all. A secret has power only so long as it remains hidden. Once revealed, especially to the right people, that power evaporates entirely. Mira considered this thoughtfully. It is a reasonable strategy, but a dangerous one. Revealing yourself prematurely, before you have secured proper protection, could place you at even greater risk rather than less. Then perhaps, Ilara said slowly, an idea beginning to take shape in her exhausted mind. We need to find someone with enough power and enough reason to protect us. Someone Cassian could not easily silence or overrule. The king himself, Mira said quietly, understanding immediately the direction of Ilara's thoughts. I do not know if I can trust him, Ilara admitted, the old wound of his rejection still aching within her chest, despite everything else happening around her. He accepted the false diagnosis without question. He turned his back on me, without even a moment's hesitation. Perhaps, Mira said gently, he was manipulated as thoroughly as you were. You do not know what pressures or false evidence Cassian may have presented to him. It is possible the king believes entirely that his decision was justified, unaware of the deception underlying it. Ilara sat in troubled silence, weighing the enormous risk of attempting to reach Draven directly against the growing danger of continuing to hide from men who had already proven willing to use force against her. Neither option offered any guarantee of safety, but doing nothing, simply continuing to run and hide indefinitely, felt increasingly untenable, given how quickly Cassian's men had managed to locate her in Hollowmere. I need time to think clearly, Ilara said finally, but I do not believe we have the luxury of extended deliberation. If Renwick returns with reinforcements, we may not have another opportunity to plan carefully. Then we should move again immediately, Mira said, rising despite her evident exhaustion. Rosalind, do you know of anywhere else nearby where Ilara could remain hidden for a few days, while we consider our next steps more carefully? Rosalind nodded. There is an abandoned hunting lodge deeper in the forest, once used by nobility for seasonal hunts but long since forgotten. It would provide adequate shelter, and its remote location makes it unlikely that Renwick would think to search there. The three women spent the remainder of the afternoon preparing for another move, gathering supplies and provisions that would sustain Ilara through several days of continued concealment. Despite the exhaustion weighing heavily on all of them, a renewed sense of purpose had settled over their preparations, driven by the growing understanding that passive hiding alone would not be sufficient to guarantee Ilara's safety, or the safety of the children she carried. As dusk began to settle over the farmstead once more, Ilara found herself standing at the edge of the property, staring toward the distant horizon, in the direction of the capital, toward the palace she had once called home, toward the man who had once been her entire world before betrayal and false accusation tore everything apart. Somewhere beyond that horizon, Draven remained unaware of the danger unfolding in his name, unaware of the children who were his own flesh and blood, growing within the body of the woman he had cast aside without question. Ilara did not know, standing there in the fading evening light, whether reaching out to him would prove her salvation or her final, fatal mistake. But she understood, with growing certainty, that the choice would soon need to be made, one way or another, regardless of how much fear still lingered in her heart at the thought of facing him again. Draven slammed his palm against the desk, the sharp crack echoing through his private study, as the physician standing before him flinched visibly. "Do not lie to me again," Draven said, his voice low and dangerous. "I have already learned of the property you acquired near the eastern border, purchased mere weeks after delivering your diagnosis of Lady Alara Voss. Explain to me how a palace physician affords such a significant investment on his salary alone." The physician, a thin, nervous man named Aldrich, wrung his hands anxiously, his eyes darting toward the door as though contemplating escape, though the 2 guards stationed there made any such attempt impossible. "Your Majesty, I assure you, the examination was conducted properly, according to every established protocol." "I did not ask you to defend your methods," Draven interrupted sharply. "I asked you to explain the property. Answer the question directly, or I will have you questioned by considerably less patient men than myself." Aldrich's composure crumbled entirely under the weight of the threat. "It was Lord Cassian," he admitted, his voice dropping to a whisper as though fearing the walls themselves might report his confession. "He approached me privately, before the examination took place. He offered payment, substantial payment, in exchange for a specific outcome to the diagnosis." The room fell utterly silent. Draven felt something cold and furious settle into his chest, a rage so complete it left him momentarily unable to speak. When he finally found his voice again, it emerged low and controlled, though every word carried unmistakable threat. "You falsified the examination. You declared Lady Alara barren, knowing the diagnosis to be false, because my own cousin paid you to do so." "Yes, Your Majesty," Aldrich whispered, his entire body trembling now. "I am deeply sorry. I did not fully understand the consequences at the time, only that Lord Cassian's payment would secure my family's future for generations. I did not think." "You did not think of the woman whose entire life you destroyed with your lies," Draven finished coldly. "You did not think of the public humiliation she suffered, the home she lost, the future that was stolen from her, all because my cousin paid you to betray your oath as a physician." Aldrich said nothing further, offering no defense that could possibly justify the magnitude of his betrayal. Draven stared at him for a long moment, fighting the urge to act on the fury coursing through his veins, before finally turning to the guards stationed near the door. "Take him to the dungeons," Draven ordered. "He will remain there until I determine the appropriate consequences for his actions, and ensure his confession is documented in full, with witnesses present, before he has any opportunity to reconsider his cooperation." As the guards led the trembling physician from the study, Draven remained alone, his mind reeling from the confirmation of what he had suspected for weeks, but had not truly allowed himself to believe, until this exact moment. Alara had been innocent. The diagnosis had been a lie, orchestrated deliberately by his own cousin, for reasons Draven could not yet fully understand, though he suspected they were rooted in Cassian's long-standing ambitions for his own daughter's future within the royal succession. The weight of his own failure crashed over him with devastating force. He had rejected Alara without question, without demanding proof, without even granting her the basic dignity of defending herself before the entire court. He had trusted his cousin's counsel and the physician's fraudulent report over the woman he claimed to love, and in doing so, he had cast her out into a world that had already proven itself hostile and dangerous, alone and without protection. He needed to find her. The realization struck him with sudden, desperate urgency, cutting through the numbness of shock that had gripped him since Aldrich's confession. Wherever Alara had gone after leaving the palace, however she had survived these past months, he needed to find her, to make right the terrible injustice he had allowed to unfold, regardless of what it cost him personally or politically. But first, he needed to address the matter of his cousin directly. Draven rose from his desk and summoned the captain of his personal guard, a stern, loyal man named Percival, who had served the royal family faithfully for over a decade. "I need Lord Cassian brought before me immediately," Draven instructed. "Discreetly, if possible. I do not wish to alert him to the reason for the summons before he stands in this room." Percival nodded sharply and departed to carry out the order. While he waited, Draven paced the length of his study, his mind churning through the implications of what he had discovered. If Cassian had orchestrated the false diagnosis so deliberately, so thoroughly, what else might he have arranged in pursuit of his ambitions? How far had his cousin's betrayal truly extended, and what other secrets remained hidden beneath the carefully constructed facade of loyal counsel he had presented for years? Nearly half an hour passed before Cassian finally arrived, his expression carrying the same practiced calm he always maintained, though something flickered briefly behind his eyes when he noted the grim severity of Draven's expression. "You summoned me, cousin?" Cassian said, closing the study door behind him. "Your guard seemed rather insistent that the matter was urgent." "Sit down, Cassian," Draven said, his voice carefully controlled, despite the fury still simmering beneath the surface. Cassian's eyes narrowed slightly at the coldness in Draven's tone, but he complied, settling into the chair across from the desk with practiced ease. "What troubles you, cousin? You seem uncharacteristically tense." "I have just finished speaking with Physician Aldrich," Draven said, watching his cousin's face carefully for any reaction. "He has told me a fascinating story about a certain payment arrangement and a certain falsified diagnosis regarding Lady Alara Voss." For the briefest moment, something flickered across Cassian's face, a flash of genuine alarm that he quickly masked beneath careful composure. "I do not understand what you are suggesting, cousin." "I believe you understand perfectly," Draven said, his voice growing harder with each word. "Do not insult my intelligence further by continuing to deny what has already been confirmed. You paid Aldrich to falsify Alara's examination, to declare her barren when no such condition actually existed. You orchestrated the entire deception, and I accepted it without question, destroying an innocent woman's life in the process, all because I trusted you completely." Cassian's carefully maintained composure finally began to crack, though even now, he attempted to salvage some measure of justification for his actions. "Everything I did for the good of this kingdom, Draven. Alara Voss was never suited to be queen. Her bloodline offered nothing of value, no strategic alliances, no strengthened borders. I acted to protect the future stability of this throne, nothing more." "You acted to protect your own ambitions," Draven said furiously, rising from his desk. "You wanted your daughter positioned for the succession, and Alara stood in your way. So you destroyed her, publicly humiliated her, cast her out into a dangerous world with nothing, all to clear a path for your own selfish designs." "I did what was necessary," Cassian said, his voice growing defensive now, though he made no further attempt to deny the accusations directly. "The kingdom's stability matters more than the feelings of a single Omega, regardless of how genuinely you believed yourself to love her." The words ignited something fierce and uncontrollable within Draven, a fury he had rarely allowed himself to feel so completely. He crossed the room in 3 quick strides and seized Cassian by the collar, hauling him roughly from the chair. "You will address her with the respect she deserves," Draven said, his voice low and dangerous, "or you will find that my restraint has limits, cousin or not. Do you have any understanding of what you have done? Do you know where she is now? Whether she is safe? Whether she has survived these past months at all?" Cassian's eyes widened slightly, and something in his expression shifted, a flicker of genuine fear finally breaking through his practiced composure. Draven noticed the change immediately and released his grip on Cassian's collar, though his fury remained undiminished. "What do you know?" Draven demanded. "That you are not telling me?" Cassian hesitated, clearly weighing the consequences of continued deception against the mounting evidence already stacked against him. Finally, with visible reluctance, he spoke. "I received word recently that Lady Alara has been residing in a village called Hollowmere, under the care of a healer, and that she is in a condition that suggests the diagnosis was indeed false." "A condition," Draven repeated slowly, his heart beginning to pound with a mixture of fury and desperate hope. "You mean she is with child?" Cassian nodded stiffly, unable to meet Draven's gaze directly. "I sent a man to confirm the information and address the situation before it could become public knowledge." "Address the situation," Draven repeated, horror creeping into his voice, as the full implications of Cassian's words settled over him. "You sent someone to silence her. To silence my child." "I sent someone to protect the succession from unnecessary complication," Cassian said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier conviction. "I did not intend genuine harm, only to ensure the matter remained contained until a more appropriate solution could be arranged." Draven felt something within him break entirely at those words, replaced by a cold, absolute determination that eclipsed even the fury still burning through his veins. "You will tell me everything you know, immediately. Every detail of this man's mission, every location he has visited, every possible threat he poses to Alara's safety. And you will pray, cousin, that no harm has come to her or to my children, because if it has, no bond of family will protect you from what follows. Cassian, finally recognizing the complete collapse of his carefully constructed position, began speaking rapidly, providing every detail he possessed regarding Renwick's mission and last known whereabouts. Draven listened with growing urgency, his mind already racing ahead to the preparations necessary for an immediate departure toward Hollowmere. Within the hour, Draven had assembled a small company of his most trusted guards, prepared to ride through the night if necessary, to reach the village, before any further harm could befall Alara or the children she carried. Cassian, under heavy guard, was confined to his chambers, pending a full investigation into the extent of his betrayal, his political future, and personal freedom, now hanging entirely in the balance. As Draven mounted his horse in the palace courtyard, the cold night air biting against his face, he allowed himself, for the first time in months, to fully acknowledge the depth of what he had lost through his own hasty judgment and misplaced trust. Whatever awaited him in Hollowmere, whatever state he found Alara in, whatever damage had already been done to the fragile trust that once existed between them, he intended to spend every remaining day of his life making amends for the terrible injustice he had allowed to unfold. The company rode hard through the darkness, urgency driving them forward at a punishing pace. Draven's thoughts consumed entirely by fear for Alara's safety, and desperate hope that they would not arrive too late to prevent whatever harm Cassian's hired man might already have inflicted. The road to Hollowmere stretched longer than Draven remembered from any map he had studied in preparation for the journey, winding through dense forest and across shallow rivers that slowed their progress considerably in the darkness. He pushed his horse harder than was wise, driven by a desperation that left no room for caution, though Percival rode close beside him, occasionally calling out warnings about hidden routes or unstable ground that Draven barely registered in his singular focus on reaching the village as quickly as possible. "Your Majesty," Percival called during a brief pause to rest the horses near a shallow stream, "we should consider stopping until first light. The horses cannot maintain this pace indefinitely, and riding blindly through unfamiliar terrain in darkness risks injury to both mount and rider." "We do not have time to rest," Draven said sharply, though he recognized the wisdom in Percival's caution even as he rejected it. "Every hour we delay is an hour Alara remains in danger, if she is not already." He could not finish the thought aloud, the possibility too horrifying to voice directly. Percival studied him for a long moment, understanding clearly the depth of desperation driving his king forward so recklessly. "We will not delay long, Your Majesty, but allow the horses a brief respite, enough to ensure we do not lose one to exhaustion or injury, partway through the journey. It would serve no one if we arrived in Hollowmere with half our company stranded along the road." Draven reluctantly agreed, dismounting to allow his horse a few minutes of rest while he paced along the riverbank, his mind racing through every possible scenario awaiting him in Hollowmere. He thought of Alara as he had last seen her, walking proudly from the great hall despite the devastating humiliation he had inflicted upon her, refusing to let the guards touch her, refusing to let anyone see her break. The memory of her strength in that moment, even as he had failed her so completely, filled him with a fierce, protective determination that overrode every physical exhaustion pressing against him after hours of hard riding. He thought also of the children Cassian had mentioned, children that were his own flesh and blood, growing within Alara's body while he had remained entirely ignorant. Consumed by grief and doubt, he had refused to properly investigate until it was almost too late. The thought of Renwick, a man clearly willing to use force against a pregnant woman on Cassian's orders, filled Draven with a rage so complete that he found himself gripping the hilt of his sword with white-knuckled intensity, silently vowing whatever consequences Renwick deserved for threatening Alara's safety. As the first gray light of dawn began to creep across the eastern horizon, the company remounted and continued their journey with renewed urgency. Draven's exhaustion had given way entirely to a singular, driving focus, every mile bringing him closer to either redemption or devastating loss, and he refused to allow himself to consider which outcome awaited him until he had exhausted every possible effort to reach Alara in time. They reached the outskirts of Hollowmere as the sun climbed fully above the horizon, the village emerging from the morning mist with a deceptive tranquility that did nothing to ease the tension coiled tightly within Draven's chest. He led his company directly toward the center of the village, where a small gathering of curious villagers had already begun to assemble, drawn by the unusual sight of royal guards riding through their quiet streets. "We seek a healer named Mira," Draven announced, dismounting quickly and addressing the gathered villagers with as much composure as he could manage, despite his mounting anxiety. "It is a matter of urgent royal business." A murmur rippled through the small crowd, and after a moment, an elderly man stepped forward, eyeing the royal guards with evident suspicion. "Mira's cottage lies at the edge of the village, near the birch grove. But I must warn you, there was some manner of disturbance there recently. A stranger came asking after her as well, and there were sounds of trouble in the night, according to those who live nearby." Draven's heart lurched painfully at the confirmation of his worst fears. "Take me there immediately," he demanded, already moving toward his horse. The elderly villager led them quickly through the narrow streets toward the edge of Hollowmere, and as the small cottage came into view nestled among the birch trees, Draven felt a fresh wave of dread settle over him at the sight of the front door hanging slightly askew on its hinges, clear evidence of the violence that had unfolded within. He dismounted before his horse had fully stopped and rushed toward the cottage, calling Alara's name with a desperation he made no attempt to conceal, though only silence answered him from within the empty dwelling. The interior bore clear signs of struggle: an overturned chair, scattered herbs from a broken jar, a poker lying abandoned near the cold hearth. But there was no sign of Alara herself, nor of the healer Mira who had apparently taken her in. "Search the surrounding area," Draven ordered his men, his voice tight, with barely controlled panic. "Question every villager who might know where they could have fled. I want this entire region searched thoroughly, and I want it done immediately." As his guards dispersed to carry out his orders, Draven remained standing in the doorway of the abandoned cottage, staring at the evidence of violence that had clearly taken place within these walls, his mind consumed by a single, desperate question that he could not yet answer. Where was Alara now, and had she managed to escape whatever danger had found its way to her door? Or had Cassian's man already succeeded in silencing her before Draven's desperate journey could possibly have reached her in time? Percival approached a short while later, guiding an elderly woman who lived in a neighboring cottage, her expression nervous as she found herself suddenly the center of attention from royal guards. "She claims to have witnessed something that night," Percival explained. "Tell His Majesty what you told me." The woman wrung her hands anxiously, casting uncertain glances between Draven and the ruined cottage behind him. "I heard shouting in the night, Your Majesty, and the sound of a struggle. I did not dare leave my home to investigate, fearing for my own safety. But near dawn, I saw a young woman running from the direction of Mira's cottage, heading toward the tree line beyond the garden. She appeared to be with child, and clearly frightened." "Which direction did she run?" Draven asked urgently, hope flaring within him at this first concrete evidence that Alara had survived the night's violence. "Toward the eastern woods," the woman said, pointing toward a dense line of trees visible beyond the cottage garden. "There is little out that way, save for old hunting trails and a distant farmstead belonging to a widow named Rosalind. I could not say for certain if that is where she was heading, but it seems the most likely destination given the direction of her flight." "And the healer, Mira, do you know what became of her?" The woman shook her head. "I did not see her again after the disturbance, Your Majesty. I can only hope she managed to escape unharmed as well, though I fear the worst, given the sounds I heard that night." Draven thanked the woman for her information, and turned immediately to his assembled guards, fresh urgency driving his next commands. "We ride for the eastern woods immediately, toward this widow's farmstead. Percival, take 2 men and continue searching the village for any further information. The rest of you, with me." They mounted quickly and rode toward the tree line the elderly woman had indicated, following a narrow, overgrown trail that wound deep into the forest, clearly used infrequently, given the tangled undergrowth threatening to obscure the path entirely in places. Draven's heart pounded with each passing mile, torn between desperate hope that they were drawing closer to Alara, and crushing fear that they might arrive to find the same scene of violence and abandonment that had greeted him at Mira's cottage. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly around them, ancient trees rising tall on either side of the narrow trail, their branches forming a thick canopy that filtered the morning sunlight into scattered, shifting patterns across the forest floor. Draven scanned every shadow, every movement among the trees, searching desperately for any sign that they were on the correct path. though the silence of the forest offered no reassurance either way. After nearly an hour of steady riding, the trees finally began to thin, revealing a modest clearing ahead, and within it, a small farmhouse with smoke curling gently from its chimney, a scene of such deceptive peace that Draven felt his chest tighten with renewed hope and fear in equal measure. He spurred his horse forward, reaching the farmhouse well ahead of his guards, and dismounted before the animal had fully stopped, rushing toward the front door with a desperation that left no room for the careful diplomatic approach that circumstances might normally have demanded. He pounded against the wooden door, calling out with a voice that cracked slightly under the weight of everything he had endured over these past desperate hours. "I am searching for Alara Voss," he called, uncertain whether the occupants would recognize her name or simply view him as another dangerous stranger, arriving unannounced. "Please, if she is here, I mean her no harm. I am Draven Ashgrove, and I have come to make right the terrible wrong I have done her." For a long, agonizing moment, silence answered him from within the farmhouse, and Draven's heart sank with the fear that he had followed a false trail entirely, that Alara remained somewhere else, still in danger, still beyond his reach. Then, slowly, the door creaked open, revealing an elderly woman with sharp, assessing eyes who studied him carefully before speaking. "You claim to be the king," the woman said, her tone carrying evident skepticism. "Forgive me if I require more than your word before I reveal anything regarding the whereabouts of any guest who might or might not be residing within my home." Draven understood her caution immediately, recognizing the protective instinct behind her careful words. "I understand your hesitation, and I respect it entirely, but I beg you, if Alara is here, if she is safe, please allow me the chance to speak with her directly. I have traveled through the night to find her, to correct the injustice I allowed to be done against her, and against our children." Something shifted in the woman's expression at the mention of children, a flicker of recognition that told Draven he had indeed found the correct location, though she still did not immediately grant him entry. "Wait here," she said finally, closing the door partially, though not fully, before disappearing back into the depths of the farmhouse, leaving Draven standing on the threshold with his heart pounding and his breath held, uncertain whether the next few moments would bring the reunion he desperately hoped for, or a rejection that would leave him searching still further for the woman he had wronged so completely. Alara stood frozen in the small kitchen of Rosalind's farmhouse, her heart pounding so violently she feared it might be audible throughout the entire house. She had heard every word exchanged at the front door, Draven's voice, unmistakable despite months of separation, carrying through the thin walls with a desperation she had never before heard from him. "He is here," Rosalind said quietly, stepping into the kitchen, her expression carefully neutral despite the gravity of the moment. "He claims to know the truth, Alara. He speaks of correcting an injustice, of the children. I do not know what to make of his sincerity, but the choice of whether to see him rests entirely with you." Alara pressed a trembling hand against her stomach, feeling the reassuring movement of the children within, and found herself torn between two equally powerful instincts. Part of her wanted nothing more than to remain hidden, to protect herself and her children from a man who had once rejected her so completely and publicly. But another part of her, a part she had tried desperately to suppress over these long, difficult months, ached with a desperate hope that perhaps, somehow, the truth had finally reached him, and that the man she had once loved might still exist beneath the cold king who had cast her aside. "I will see him," Alara said finally, her voice steadier than she felt internally. "But Rosalind, please remain nearby. I do not yet know what to expect from this meeting." Rosalind nodded and returned to the front door, and a moment later, Draven stepped into the small farmhouse kitchen, his appearance so different from the composed, distant king who had presided over her rejection months earlier that Alara barely recognized him at first glance. His clothing was travel-worn and dusty, his face etched with exhaustion and something that looked remarkably like genuine anguish, and the moment his eyes found her standing across the small room, he stopped entirely still, as though the sight of her had robbed him of the ability to move or speak. "Alara," he finally managed, his voice breaking slightly on her name. "You are alive. You are safe." "No thanks to you," Alara said, her voice carrying more coldness than she had initially intended, though the months of pain and betrayal refused to be so easily set aside, despite the evident emotion in his expression. Draven flinched visibly at her words, though he did not argue against their justice. "You are right to be angry with me. I do not deserve your forgiveness, and I have not come here expecting it. I have come because I have learned the truth, Ilara. The diagnosis was false. Cassian paid the physician to falsify the results, to declare you barren, when no such condition ever existed." Ilara felt something complicated stir within her chest at his words. Vindication mixed painfully with the fresh reminder of exactly how thoroughly she had been betrayed, not only by Cassian's deliberate cruelty, but by Draven's own willingness to believe the worst of her without question or investigation. "I know," she said quietly. "I have known for months. It did not take a confession from your cousin's physician to reveal what my own body made clear far sooner." Draven's gaze dropped instinctively to her rounded stomach, visible even beneath the loose clothing she wore, and something in his expression shifted, a complicated mixture of wonder and guilt that seemed to overwhelm him entirely for a long moment. "The children," he whispered. "Cassian mentioned there might be children, but I did not allow myself to fully believe it until this exact moment, seeing you standing here before me." "Children," Ilara confirmed, watching his reaction carefully. "Twins, according to Mira's assessment." "You're twins, Draven, conceived before you rejected me so publicly, and cast me out into a world that nearly cost me my life, on more than one occasion since." The weight of her words settled visibly over him, and for a moment, Ilara thought he might actually break down entirely, under the crushing guilt evident in his expression. "I am so sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have questioned the diagnosis. I should have trusted you, trusted what we shared, rather than accepting my cousin's counsel, and a stranger's fraudulent report over your own word. I failed you completely, Ilara, and I understand, if you cannot find it within yourself to forgive such a devastating betrayal." Ilara studied him for a long moment, torn between the genuine remorse, evident in every word he spoke, and the lingering pain of months spent alone, hunted and afraid, consequences that had resulted directly from his hasty judgment and misplaced trust. "Where is Mira?" she asked instead, unable to fully address the larger question of forgiveness, while such immediate concerns remained unresolved. "She fought off your cousin's man to give me the chance to escape. I have not seen her since that night. My guards are searching the village and surrounding areas for her even now," Draven said. "I promise you, Ilara, I will not rest until she is found safely, and until Renwick, the man who threatened you, faces full justice for his actions." At that moment, the sound of approaching horses drew everyone's attention toward the farmhouse window, and a moment later, one of Draven's guards appeared at the door, escorting a familiar figure whose presence immediately flooded Ilara with overwhelming relief. "Mira," she called out, rushing forward as quickly as her advanced pregnancy allowed, embracing the healer tightly, despite the bruises still visible along her jaw and arms from the violent confrontation days earlier. "I am glad to see you safe," Mira said, returning the embrace warmly, before pulling back to study Ilara's face carefully. "And I see you have found your way to a rather significant conversation already underway." Draven approached them both, his expression carrying genuine gratitude as he addressed Mira directly. "I owe you an enormous debt for protecting Ilara when I failed to do so myself. Whatever you require, whatever compensation might begin to address what you have sacrificed on her behalf, you have only to ask." Mira studied him carefully for a long moment, clearly weighing the sincerity behind his words before finally responding. "I require nothing beyond ensuring Ilara and her children remain safe from this point forward, Your Majesty. That is compensation enough for anything I have done." Draven nodded solemnly, then turned his attention back to Ilara, his expression growing more serious as he addressed the larger implications of everything that had unfolded. "Ilara, I understand if you cannot trust me easily after everything that has happened. But I beg you to return to the palace with me, not for my own sake, but for the safety and well-being of our children. Mira has surely told you of the risks involved in carrying twins, risks that require medical resources far beyond what any village healer, however skilled, can provide alone." Ilara glanced toward Mira, who nodded slightly in confirmation of the very concerns she had raised weeks earlier regarding the pregnancy's inherent dangers. The practical reality of her situation could not be ignored, regardless of the complicated emotions still swirling within her, regarding Draven's presence and his belated attempt at making amends. "I will return," Elara said finally, "but understand, Draven, that my agreement is conditional on the safety and well-being of these children, not upon any restoration of what once existed between us." That trust was broken too completely to simply be repaired through a single conversation, however sincere your remorse might genuinely be. "I understand," Draven said quietly, accepting her terms without argument or complaint. "I do not expect forgiveness to come easily, nor do I believe I deserve it freely given. I only ask for the opportunity to prove, through action rather than words alone, that I am capable of becoming the man you once believed me to be, worthy of the trust I so carelessly destroyed." As preparations began for the journey back toward the palace, Elara found herself watching Draven with a complicated mixture of lingering anger, cautious hope, and the practical recognition that whatever emotional reconciliation might or might not eventually occur between them, the immediate priority remained the safety of the children she carried. Children who deserved every possible advantage, as their difficult, dangerous pregnancy continued to progress toward its uncertain conclusion. Mira, watching the careful, tentative interactions between Elara and Draven with the practiced observation of someone who had spent decades understanding the complicated nature of human relationships, allowed herself a small, cautious flicker of hope that perhaps, despite everything that had transpired, some measure of healing remained possible for the small, fractured family now beginning the difficult journey back toward the world they had all been forced to flee. The journey back to the palace would take several days, given the necessity of traveling at a pace suitable for a heavily pregnant woman, and Draven insisted on the finest available accommodations at each stop along the route, determined to provide every possible comfort in partial atonement for the suffering Elara had endured since her rejection. But even as physical comforts were carefully arranged, the emotional distance between them remained palpable, a careful, cautious politeness replacing the easy intimacy they had once shared, both of them uncertain how to navigate the complicated territory between the devastating betrayal of the past and whatever uncertain future now awaited them together. On the second night of their journey, the company stopped at a modest inn along the main road, and Draven arranged for Elara to have the finest available room, while he took quarters nearby, close enough to ensure her protection, but respectfully distant, given the fragile state of their relationship. Elara found herself unable to sleep despite her exhaustion, her mind churning with everything that had happened, and eventually she rose and made her way to the small balcony attached to her room, seeking the cool night air to help settle her restless thoughts. She was not entirely surprised, a short while later, to hear soft footsteps approaching, and turned to find Draven standing at the edge of the balcony, keeping a respectful distance while his eyes carried an expression of quiet longing he made no particular effort to hide. "I could not sleep either," he admitted, when she said nothing to acknowledge his presence. "May I join you for a moment, or would you prefer solitude?" Elara considered the question for a long moment, before finally nodding, gesturing toward the space beside her at the balcony railing. "You may stay. But do not mistake this for forgiveness, Draven. I still have many questions that remain unanswered." "Ask whatever you wish," he said, settling beside her, though maintaining careful distance. "I owe you complete honesty, regardless of how difficult the answers might prove." "Why did you not question the diagnosis?" Elara asked, the question that had haunted her most consistently throughout her months of exile finally finding voice. "We shared a bond, Draven. I would have expected that connection to offer you some instinct, some warning that something was wrong with the situation, rather than simply accepting Cassian's counsel without hesitation." Draven was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with how best to answer honestly. "I felt something," he admitted finally, "a wrongness, an unease, that I could not fully articulate even to myself in the moment. But I told myself it was simply grief, simply the shock of unexpected news, rather than trusting that instinct as a genuine warning. I have asked myself every day since why I did not fight harder for you in that moment, why I allowed doubt and my cousin's persuasive counsel to override what my own heart was telling me. I do not have a satisfying answer, Elara, beyond acknowledging that I failed you through a combination of misplaced trust and cowardice I am deeply ashamed of." Elara absorbed his words in silence, appreciating the honesty, even as it did little to fully ease the lingering pain of his betrayal. "And Cassian? What will become of him, now that his deception has been exposed?" He remains confined within the palace, pending full investigation, Draven said, his voice hardening slightly at the mention of his cousin's name. The physician who falsified your examination has already confessed fully, providing documented evidence of Cassian's involvement. Given the severity of his actions, particularly the attempt to have you harmed through Renwick, I anticipate the consequences will be severe. Treason against the crown, orchestrating harm against a member of the royal family, however estranged that member might have been at the time due to his own manipulation, carries significant penalties under our laws. Alara asked quietly, though she was uncertain how she felt about the possibility, her emotions still too raw and complicated to easily process the fate awaiting the man who had caused her so much suffering. That decision has not yet been finalized, Draven said. The council will need to review the full evidence, and ultimately, the final judgment rests with me as king. I have not yet decided what justice truly requires in this situation, though I assure you, whatever consequences he faces will reflect the full severity of his crimes. They stood together in silence for a while longer, the cool night air settling comfortably around them despite the weight of their conversation. And Alara found herself, despite everything, grateful for the honesty Draven had offered, even if it did little to fully repair the trust that had been so completely shattered months earlier. I need you to understand something, Alara said finally, breaking the silence between them. Regardless of what happens between us personally, regardless of whether I ever find myself able to trust you again as I once did, my priority now and always will be the safety and well-being of these children. If you cannot commit to protecting them fully, regardless of our personal relationship, then I will find another path forward, one that does not depend on your continued goodwill. I understand completely, Draven said, his voice carrying absolute conviction. These children are my responsibility, as much as yours, Alara, regardless of what becomes of us as a couple. I will protect them with everything I possess, for as long as I live, whether or not you ever find it within yourself to forgive me for the harm I have caused. Alara studied his face carefully in the moonlight, searching for any sign of insincerity, but finding only exhausted, genuine conviction reflected in his tired eyes. It was not forgiveness, not yet, and perhaps not for a long while still to come, but it was, she recognized slowly, a foundation upon which something new might eventually be built, provided Draven continued to demonstrate through consistent action the sincerity of the words he had spoken this night. "Good night, Draven," she said finally, turning back toward her room, though something in her tone carried slightly less coldness than it had at the beginning of their conversation. "Good night, Alara," he replied softly, watching her retreat into the room before finally turning to make his own way back toward his quarters, his heart heavy with the enormous weight of everything still left unresolved between them, though carrying also a small, cautious flicker of hope that perhaps, given enough time, and enough proof of his genuine commitment to change, some version of reconciliation might eventually prove possible after all. The palace gates rose before them at last, gleaming gold in the late afternoon sun, and Alara felt her chest tighten with a complicated mixture of dread and defiance as the familiar towers came into view. The last time she had passed through these gates, she had been walking away in disgrace, humiliated and alone. Now she returned carrying the very proof of her innocence within her own body, though the prospect of facing the court that had once condemned her so publicly filled her with fresh anxiety despite Draven's assurances of protection. "You do not need to face the court immediately," Draven said, riding close beside her carriage as they approached the entrance. "I can arrange for you to rest privately first, and address the matter of your return more gradually, if that would be easier." "No," Alara said firmly, surprising herself with the strength of her own conviction. "I do not intend to hide any longer, Draven. I was humiliated publicly, and I will be vindicated just as publicly. Let the entire court witness the truth of what your cousin attempted to destroy." Draven studied her with an expression of evident admiration mixed with lingering guilt. "As you wish. I will summon the full court to assemble within the hour." Word of Alara's return spread through the palace with remarkable speed, and by the time she stood once more before the great hall, the same marble floor beneath her feet where she had once suffered such devastating humiliation, the room had filled entirely with nobles, advisors, and curious onlookers, all eager to witness whatever revelation had prompted the king's sudden, unexplained journey, and equally sudden return, with the very woman he had publicly rejected months earlier. Alara walked into the hall with her chin raised, her hand resting protectively over the visible curve of her advancing pregnancy, refusing to allow even a flicker of the old shame to show upon her face. Whispers rippled through the assembled court as she passed, disbelief and curiosity mingling openly among the nobility who had witnessed her rejection and now struggled to comprehend the meaning of her unexpected return. Draven took his place upon the throne, though rather than settling immediately into judgment, he remained standing, addressing the court with a gravity that silenced the murmuring crowd almost immediately. "Months ago," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall, "I stood in this very room and rejected Lady Alara Voss as my mate, based upon a diagnosis of infertility delivered by our palace physician. I accepted that diagnosis without question, without demanding proof beyond the physician's word, and in doing so, I committed a grave injustice against a woman who had done nothing to deserve the humiliation and hardship that followed." The court remained utterly silent, every eye fixed upon the king as he continued, his voice growing harder with each subsequent word. "That diagnosis was false. It was deliberately falsified by physician Aldrich, under payment and pressure from Lord Cassian, my own cousin, who sought to remove Lady Alara from the succession, in order to advance his own ambitions for his daughter's future position within this court. Physician Aldrich has confessed fully to this crime, and evidence of Lord Cassian's involvement has been thoroughly documented." Gasps and shocked murmurs finally broke the stunned silence, though Draven raised a hand, and the court quickly fell quiet once more, awaiting the remainder of his address. "Lady Alara was never barren," Draven continued. "She is, in fact, carrying twins, conceived before her rejection, children who are my own rightful heirs. She has spent these past months hunted and endangered by Lord Cassian's hired agent, forced into hiding, nearly losing her life on more than one occasion, all due to a deception, orchestrated for the sole purpose of political ambition." The hall erupted into a cacophony of shocked exclamations, nobles turning to whisper urgently among themselves, though Draven's raised hand once again brought silence to the assembled crowd. "I formally restore Lady Alara Voss to her position as my mate and future queen of this kingdom," Draven declared, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "The children she carries are recognized as legitimate heirs to the throne of Veyrath, and any who dare question this legitimacy will answer directly to me." He turned then toward a side entrance of the hall, where 2 guards escorted Lord Cassian into the chamber, his wrists bound, his expression a careful mask that could not entirely hide the desperation beneath its surface, as he found himself facing the full weight of the court's judgment. "Lord Cassian," Draven said, his voice cold and formal now, all traces of familial affection stripped entirely from his tone, "you stand accused of orchestrating a false diagnosis against Lady Alara Voss, of manipulating the crown's judgment through deliberate deception, and of ordering harm against a member of the royal family through your agent, Renwick, who has since been apprehended and has corroborated the full extent of your involvement in these crimes." Cassian's composure finally shattered entirely under the weight of the accusations laid bare before the assembled court. "Draven, cousin, please, whatever punishment you intend, consider the years of loyal service I have provided, consider the family bond we share." "You considered neither loyalty nor family when you orchestrated this deception," Draven interrupted sharply. "You considered neither when you sent a man to threaten a pregnant woman's life. Whatever bond we once shared, you severed it yourself through your own actions, just as thoroughly as I once severed my bond with Alara through my own foolish trust in your counsel." The hall fell silent once more, as Draven turned to address the full court, his expression carrying the weight of a difficult decision finally reached, after days of careful deliberation. "For crimes of treason against the crown, for the deliberate falsification of medical records used to deceive the king, and for ordering harm against a member of the royal family, Lord Cassian is hereby stripped of all titles, lands, and privileges. He will be exiled from the kingdom of Veyrath permanently, forbidden from ever returning under penalty of death, and his properties will be seized by the crown to provide restitution for the harm caused to Lady Alara during her months of forced exile." Cassian's expression crumpled at the pronouncement, though he offered no further protest, seeming to understand that any additional pleading would prove entirely futile given the severity of evidence against him. The guards led him from the hall, and as the heavy doors closed behind him, A palpable sense of relief seemed to settle over the assembled court, the tension of the dramatic revelation finally beginning to ease. Draven turned back to Alara, who had remained standing throughout the entire proceeding, her expression carrying a complicated mixture of vindication and lingering exhaustion from the emotional weight of everything that had transpired. He descended from the throne and crossed the hall to stand before her, and for a moment, the entire court seemed to hold its collective breath, awaiting whatever gesture might follow this dramatic reversal of fortune. "Lady Alara Voss," Draven said, his voice softer now, though still carrying clearly through the silent hall. "I have wronged you, in ways I can never fully repay. I do not ask for your immediate forgiveness, nor do I expect the trust between us to be restored simply through words alone. But I vow, before this entire court, before every noble and advisor assembled here today, that I will spend whatever years remain to me, proving myself worthy of the trust I so carelessly destroyed, and ensuring that you and our children want for nothing, and fear nothing, for as long as I have breath to protect you." Alara studied him for a long moment, acutely aware of the hundreds of eyes fixed upon this moment, though she found, to her own surprise, that she no longer cared particularly about the court's judgment of her response. She had survived months of danger and hardship through her own strength and the loyalty of a healer who had risked everything to protect her. Whatever came next between herself and Draven would be built on her own terms, at her own pace, regardless of the audience currently watching so intently. "I accept your vow," Alara said finally, her voice carrying clearly across the hall, "though I remind you, and this entire court, that vows are proven through consistent action over time, not through a single dramatic declaration, however sincere it might currently feel. I will remain here, for the safety and well-being of our children, and I will observe carefully whether your actions in the coming months truly match the promises you have made today." A murmur of approval rippled through certain sections of the court, nobles nodding in evident respect for the strength and conditions Alara had laid out so clearly despite the public nature of the moment. Draven, rather than appearing offended by her measured response, seemed instead to find something admirable in her continued resolve, inclining his head in acknowledgement of her terms. "That is more than fair," he said quietly, "and precisely what I deserve to earn, rather than simply receive freely." As the court finally began to disperse, whispered conversations erupting throughout the hall regarding the dramatic revelations of the afternoon, Mira approached Alara's side, having remained quietly near the entrance throughout the entire proceeding, her expression carrying evident pride at the strength and composure Alara had displayed throughout such an emotionally overwhelming ordeal. "You handled that with remarkable grace," Mira said quietly, as they made their way from the great hall together. "I confess, I was uncertain how you would manage facing this court again after everything you endured. I am not the same woman who left this palace in disgrace," Alara said, resting a hand against her rounded stomach as they walked. "Everything that happened these past months, the fear, the danger, the strength I discovered I possessed when survival demanded it, has changed me fundamentally. I will not simply return to my old role as though nothing occurred, regardless of how genuine Draven's remorse might prove to be over time." Mira smiled warmly at this declaration, squeezing Alara's hand affectionately. "Good. That is exactly the strength you will need in the months ahead, both for yourself and for the children who will soon depend entirely upon your protection and guidance as they enter this complicated world." As they made their way toward the private chambers that had once again been prepared for Alara's use within the palace, now considerably more luxurious and carefully appointed than her previous accommodations had ever been, Alara allowed herself, finally, a small measure of genuine relief. The immediate danger that had haunted her these past months had finally passed, Cassian's treachery exposed and punished, Renwick presumably facing justice of his own for his role in the attempted harm against her. But she understood clearly that the path ahead remained complicated, filled with the delicate work of rebuilding trust with Draven, of preparing for the arrival of her children amid the complex political realities of court life, and of ensuring that whatever future unfolded from this point forward would be built upon honesty and genuine partnership, rather than the blind trust and hasty judgment that had nearly cost her everything in the first place. That evening, as Alara settled into her newly restored chambers, marveling at the strange familiarity of surroundings she had once believed she would never see again, a soft knock at her door announced Draven's arrival. He stood in the doorway with visible hesitation, as though uncertain whether his presence would be welcomed even after the formal reconciliation declared before the court earlier that day. "May I come in?" he asked. "There are matters I wish to discuss, if you are not too exhausted from today's proceedings." Alara gestured him inside, settling into a chair near the fireplace, while he remained standing awkwardly near the door for a moment, before finally taking the seat across from her. "I wanted to inform you personally," Draven said, "that Renwick has been captured. He was apprehended near the border while attempting to flee the kingdom entirely, likely fearing the consequences once word reached him of Cassian's exposure. He has confessed fully to his role in the attack at Mira's cottage, and to receiving direct orders from Cassian to ensure your silence, whatever that ultimately required." Ilara absorbed this information with a complicated mixture of relief and lingering unease. What will become of him? He faces imprisonment for his crimes, though given that he was acting under orders rather than independent malice, his sentence will likely prove less severe than Cassian's exile. I wanted you to know, regardless, that he no longer poses any threat to your safety, or the safety of our children. "Thank you for telling me," Ilara said quietly, some of the tension in her shoulders finally easing at the confirmation that this particular danger had been fully resolved. Draven hesitated again before continuing, his expression growing more uncertain. "There is something else I wish to discuss, though I understand if you would prefer to postpone this conversation given everything else you have endured today. Cassian's exile has created considerable uncertainty within certain factions of the court, nobles who had aligned themselves with his ambitions, and now find themselves without a clear political patron. I do not anticipate immediate danger from this situation, but I wanted you to be aware that not everyone within these walls will necessarily celebrate your return with the same enthusiasm as the majority of the court demonstrated today." Ilara considered this warning carefully, recognizing the wisdom in Draven's continued caution, despite the apparent resolution of the immediate crisis. "You believe some of Cassian's allies might still pose a threat, even with him removed from the equation entirely." "It is possible," Draven admitted. "I do not wish to alarm you unnecessarily, but I would rather you remain informed, and appropriately cautious, than caught unaware by any lingering resentment his exile might have created among those who benefited from his previous influence within the court." "I appreciate your honesty," Ilara said, and found that she genuinely meant it, recognizing in this moment of careful transparency exactly the kind of consistent, trustworthy communication that might eventually help rebuild the foundation of trust between them, however slowly and cautiously that process might need to unfold. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, the fire crackling gently in the hearth, and Ilara found herself studying Draven's profile in the flickering firelight, searching for traces of the man she had once loved so completely beneath the weight of everything that had transpired between them. "Draven," she said finally, breaking the silence, "I want you to understand something clearly. I do not hate you, despite everything that happened. I understand, to some degree, how thoroughly your cousin manipulated the circumstances surrounding my rejection. But understanding is not the same as forgiveness, and forgiveness is not the same as forgetting the very real danger and hardship I endured these past months because of decisions made too hastily, without proper investigation or trust in what we once shared. I understand completely," Draven said softly. "And I do not expect you to offer forgiveness before it has been genuinely earned through my continued actions. I only hope you will allow me the opportunity to demonstrate, through patience and consistency, that I am capable of becoming a partner worthy of your trust once again, however long that process might require." Ilara nodded slowly, appreciating the humility evident in his response, so different from the cold, distant king who had presided over her rejection months earlier. "I am willing to allow that opportunity," she said finally. "But Draven, understand that my patience, while genuine, is not unlimited. Show me, through your actions in the weeks and months ahead, that the man who rides through the night to rescue a woman he wronged is the true measure of your character, rather than the man who so easily accepted a false diagnosis without question." "I will not disappoint you again," Draven vowed, his voice carrying quiet, absolute conviction. "Whatever it requires, however long it takes, I intend to prove myself worthy of the trust and love we once shared, and that I hope, someday, we might rebuild together." As the evening drew to a close, and Draven finally took his leave, allowing Ilara the rest she desperately needed after such an emotionally exhausting day, She remained alone in her chambers for a while longer, watching the dying embers of the fire, and reflecting on the strange, complicated turn her circumstances had taken. Months ago, she had walked out of this very palace in complete disgrace, believing her life and future entirely destroyed by a lie she had no power to disprove. Now she found herself restored to her former position, vindicated before the entire court, carrying within her the very proof of her innocence that would soon enter the world as the legitimate heirs to the throne of Veyrath. But vindication alone could not fully heal the wounds of betrayal, nor could a single day's dramatic revelation erase months of fear, danger, and heartbreak so easily. Whatever future awaited her within these palace walls, Ilara understood clearly that it would require patience, careful vigilance against lingering political threats, and a willingness to allow trust to be rebuilt slowly, through consistent action rather than grand gestures alone, before she could truly consider the wounds of her rejection fully healed. In a quieter corner of the palace, far from the warmth of Ilara's chambers, a woman named Lady Vesna sat alone in her private study, staring into an untouched glass of wine, her expression carrying none of the celebratory relief that had swept through much of the court following the dramatic revelations of the afternoon. Vesna had been among Cassian's closest allies for years, her own family's fortunes tied intimately to his rising influence within the court, and his sudden, humiliating exile threatened to unravel ambitions she had spent a lifetime carefully cultivating. Her son, a young nobleman named Edmund, had been quietly promised a position of considerable influence once Cassian's plans for the succession reached fruition, a promise now rendered entirely worthless by the day's events. Vesna could not afford to let such carefully laid ambitions collapse without at least attempting some manner of recovery, however difficult the circumstances had suddenly become. A soft knock interrupted her troubled thoughts, and Edmund entered without waiting for a response, his expression carrying the same barely contained frustration that had gripped his mother throughout the afternoon. "Cassian has been exiled," Edmund said without preamble, closing the door behind him. "Everything we worked toward, gone in a single afternoon." "Lower your voice," Vesna snapped, glancing anxiously toward the door despite its closure. "These walls carry sound further than you might assume, particularly given how closely the entire court is watching for any sign of continued disloyalty following today's revelations." Edmund crossed the room and settled into the chair across from his mother, his expression sullen. "What do we do now? Our alliance with Cassian is worthless. Worse than worthless, given that any continued association with him now carries the risk of suspicion falling upon us as well." Vesna considered the question carefully, her mind already working through the complicated calculations of court politics that had sustained her family's influence for generations. "We adapt," she said finally. "Cassian's downfall does not have to mean our own, provided we distance ourselves quickly and convincingly enough. Perhaps there is even opportunity to be found in this situation, if approached with sufficient care." "What kind of opportunity?" Edmund asked, curiosity beginning to override his earlier frustration. "The Lady Ilara has returned to considerable favor, and the king appears genuinely determined to reconcile with her fully," Vesna said thoughtfully. "If we were to align ourselves visibly with her restoration, to demonstrate loyalty to her cause rather than lingering association with Cassian's ambitions, we might yet find a path toward continued influence within this court, regardless of today's unfortunate developments." Edmund studied his mother with a mixture of surprise and reluctant admiration at the swiftness of her strategic recalculation. "You believe we could gain her trust, after our previous alignment with the very man who orchestrated her suffering?" "Trust is not necessarily required," Vesna said, a calculating gleam entering her eyes. "Only the appearance of loyalty, carefully maintained, until such time as it might prove useful to demonstrate genuine value. Court politics rarely reward sentiment over pragmatism, Edmund. We survive by adapting to whatever circumstances present themselves, regardless of personal feelings toward those we must now court for favor." Neither Vesna nor Edmund could have known, as they plotted their careful strategy for continued relevance within the shifting political landscape of the court, that their calculated maneuvering would eventually intersect with Ilara's life in ways far more consequential than either of them currently anticipated, nor that the coming months would test not only the fragile trust being rebuilt between Ilara and Draven, but the very stability of the succession itself. As the difficult final stages of Ilara's pregnancy approached, amid a court still simmering with unresolved political tension following Cassian's dramatic and humiliating fall from grace. Alara pressed a hand against the small of her back as she made her way slowly through the palace gardens, the weight of her advancing pregnancy making even simple walks considerably more exhausting than they had been in earlier months. The physicians assigned to her care, carefully selected this time by Draven himself, with no connection whatsoever to Cassian's previous influence, had advised regular gentle exercise, and Alara found the fresh air and quiet beauty of the gardens preferable to the confined comfort of her chambers. "Lady Alara," a voice called out, and she turned to find Lady Vesna approaching along the garden path, accompanied by a young man Alara vaguely recognized as her son. "I hope you do not mind the intrusion. I wish to offer my sincere congratulations on your restoration, and to express how deeply troubled I was to learn of the injustice you suffered at Lord Cassian's hands." Alara studied the woman carefully, recalling vague memories of Vesna's close association with Cassian throughout the months before her rejection. Something in the woman's overly effusive politeness felt calculated rather than genuine, though Alara could not immediately identify the source of her unease. "Thank you for your kind words, Lady Vesna," Alara said carefully, maintaining polite formality, while remaining cautiously reserved. "It has certainly been a difficult chapter, though I am grateful the truth was eventually revealed." "Indeed," Vesna said, falling into step beside Alara as she continued her walk, despite not having been explicitly invited to do so. "Cassian's betrayal has shocked the entire court. I confess, I considered him a trusted advisor for many years, never suspecting the depth of ambition driving his counsel. It has been a difficult lesson in the dangers of misplaced trust, one I suspect you understand far better than most, given everything you have personally endured." Alara noted the subtle implication in Vesna's words, an attempt perhaps to position herself as similarly deceived by Cassian's manipulation, distancing herself from any suggestion of complicity in his schemes. "It is certainly a lesson many within this court would do well to learn," Alara said neutrally, offering no particular reassurance regarding Vesna's own position. "My son Edmund has expressed great admiration for the strength you demonstrated throughout this ordeal," Vesna continued, gesturing toward the young man walking quietly beside her. "Perhaps, once your children arrive, he might have the honor of serving in whatever capacity would prove useful to the royal nursery. He has always possessed a particular gift for diplomacy and careful judgment." The suggestion, though couched in seemingly innocent terms, set Alara's instincts firmly on alert. She recognized immediately the political maneuvering underlying Vesna's carefully constructed approach, an attempt to secure influence and position near the royal heirs before their birth, regardless of whatever genuine loyalty or lack thereof actually existed beneath the surface politeness. "I appreciate the offer," Alara said carefully, "though decisions regarding the royal nursery will be made jointly between myself and King Draven, based upon careful consideration of trustworthiness and suitability, once the children have safely arrived. I am certain you understand the particular caution such decisions now require, given recent events." Vesna's smile remained fixed in place, though something flickered briefly behind her eyes at the subtle rebuff, a recognition that her attempted maneuvering had not gone entirely undetected. "Of course, Lady Alara. Caution is entirely understandable given the circumstances. I only wish to offer whatever support our family might provide, given the difficulties you have faced." The conversation continued for a while longer with careful, polite formality on both sides, though Alara remained internally wary throughout the remainder of the exchange, recognizing that whatever genuine sentiment existed beneath Vesna's words, the underlying motivation appeared far more calculated than the woman's carefully composed expression suggested. Later that evening, as Alara relayed the details of the encounter to Mira, who had remained at the palace to assist with the ongoing medical care throughout the remainder of the pregnancy, the healer's expression grew thoughtful and concerned. "Vesna's family has long been associated with Cassian's political faction," Mira said, settling into a chair near the fireplace in Alara's private sitting room. "Her sudden interest in aligning herself with your favor, so soon after his exile, strikes me as precisely the kind of calculated political survival strategy that court intrigue so often produces. I would advise considerable caution regarding any offers of assistance or loyalty from that particular family, at least until their sincerity can be more thoroughly demonstrated over time." "I share your concern," Alara agreed, resting a protective hand against her rounded stomach. Though I do not yet know what genuine threat, if any, such political maneuvering might actually pose to my safety, or the safety of my children. Perhaps none directly, Mira acknowledged. Court politics often involve considerable maneuvering for position and influence, without necessarily translating into genuine physical danger. But given everything you have already endured through Cassian's machinations, I believe it is wise to remain vigilant regarding anyone whose loyalty has not yet been thoroughly proven through consistent, trustworthy action. Elara nodded in agreement, grateful once again for Mira's steady presence and careful counsel throughout the ongoing complications of her return to palace life. Their conversation was interrupted a short while later by Draven's arrival, his expression carrying visible concern as he entered the sitting room. "I heard about your encounter with Lady Vesna in the gardens today," he said, settling into a chair near Elara's own. "I wanted to reassure you that I share your caution regarding her family's sudden interest in demonstrating loyalty. I have instructed my personal guard to monitor the situation carefully, though I do not currently believe there is cause for immediate alarm." "Thank you for taking my concerns seriously," Elara said, appreciating the continued transparency and communication that had characterized Draven's behavior consistently since her return to the palace. "I confess, after everything that happened with Cassian, I find it difficult to trust easily, even amid seemingly harmless social interactions." "That caution is entirely justified," Draven said gently, "and I do not wish for you to feel pressured to extend trust to anyone within this court before it has been genuinely earned through demonstrated reliability, myself included." Elara offered him a small, genuine smile at this acknowledgement, appreciating the continued humility he had demonstrated throughout the weeks since her return, so different from the careless certainty that had characterized his behavior during the devastating rejection months earlier. Their relationship remained far from fully repaired, careful conversations and gradual tentative trust slowly replacing the easy intimacy they had once shared, before everything fell apart. But Elara found herself, despite lingering caution, beginning to believe genuinely in the possibility of eventual reconciliation, provided Draven continued to demonstrate the same consistent care and transparency he had shown since bringing her safely back to the palace. As the weeks progressed, and Elara's pregnancy advanced further toward its conclusion, the political tension surrounding Cassian's exile gradually began to settle into a more stable, if still cautious, equilibrium. Vesna and her son continued their careful attempts at demonstrating loyalty, though Elara remained appropriately guarded regarding their true intentions, never fully allowing them close access to information or influence that might prove exploitable should their apparent reformation prove insincere. But even as the immediate political dangers seemed to recede into manageable background tension, a new concern began to emerge, one rooted not in court intrigue, but in the increasingly complicated physical realities of Elara's advancing pregnancy. The royal physicians, examining her with careful regularity, began expressing growing concern regarding certain complications that Mira's earlier assessment had suggested might arise as the twins continued to develop. Complications that would require extremely careful management as the pregnancy approached its final, most dangerous stages. One evening, as Mira and the lead royal physician, a careful, experienced man named Dr. Aldous, concluded a particularly thorough examination, Elara noticed a troubled exchange of glances between the two healers that immediately heightened her own anxiety regarding whatever concerns they were discussing, without yet sharing directly with her. "What is it?" she asked, sitting up carefully on the examination table. "Please, do not attempt to shield me from difficult information. I would rather understand fully whatever risks I face than remain ignorant of complications that might affect my own safety or that of my children." Dr. Aldous exchanged one final glance with Mira before finally addressing Elara directly, his expression carrying careful, measured concern. "Lady Elara, the position and development of the twins suggests that the delivery, when it eventually occurs, will likely prove considerably more complicated than a typical birth, even accounting for the inherent complications common to twin pregnancies. I do not wish to alarm you unnecessarily, but I believe it would be prudent to begin making preparations now for a delivery that may require significant medical intervention to ensure the safety of both yourself and the children." Elara felt a fresh wave of anxiety settle over her at this news, though she forced herself to remain calm and focused, recognizing the importance of clear thinking as they navigated whatever challenges lay ahead in the difficult weeks remaining before her children's arrival. What kind of preparations do you recommend? I believe it would be wise to relocate you to chambers, specifically prepared for the delivery, well in advance of your expected date, Dr. Aldous explained, with all necessary medical equipment and personnel readily available at a moment's notice, rather than waiting until labor has already begun to make such arrangements. Given the complications we anticipate, every precaution taken in advance could prove critical to ensuring a safe outcome for everyone involved. Ilara nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of this new challenge even as she felt a fierce, protective determination settling over her, the same resolve that had carried her safely through months of danger and hardship since her initial rejection from these very palace walls. Whatever complications awaited her in the final weeks of this pregnancy, she intended to face them with the same strength and determination that had already carried her and her children through so much adversity, trusting in the careful preparation and skilled medical care now being assembled specifically to protect them through whatever difficult trials still remained ahead. Draven, informed immediately of the physician's concerns, threw himself into ensuring every possible resource was made available for Ilara's care. He summoned specialists from distant regions of the kingdom, men and women whose expertise in complicated births exceeded even that available within the palace's own medical staff, and spared no expense in preparing chambers specifically designed to handle whatever emergencies might arise during the delivery itself. I want you to know, he told Ilara one evening, as they sat together reviewing the preparations Dr. Aldous had recommended, that nothing will be left to chance in ensuring your safety and the safety of our children. Whatever resources this kingdom possesses, whatever expertise can be gathered from across our borders, will be made available without hesitation. I appreciate that, Ilara said, though a flicker of fear remained visible beneath her composed exterior. I confess, despite everything I have already survived these past months, I find myself more frightened by the prospect of the delivery itself than by any danger Cassian's schemes ever posed directly. Draven reached out, hesitating only briefly before taking her hand gently in his own, relieved when she did not immediately withdraw from the contact. It is natural to feel afraid, Ilara. What you are facing carries genuine risk, and pretending otherwise would serve neither of us well. But I promise you, whatever fear you carry, you do not carry it alone. I will be here throughout, for whatever support I can offer, and every physician and healer within reach will be dedicated entirely to ensuring the safest possible outcome. Ilara studied their joined hands for a long moment, appreciating the warmth and reassurance of the gesture, even as complicated emotions continued to swirl within her, regarding the broader state of their relationship. Trust remained a fragile, carefully rebuilt thing between them, but in moments like this, she found herself increasingly able to recognize the genuine sincerity behind Draven's continued efforts at demonstrating reliability and care. Thank you, she said finally, allowing her hand to remain within his, a moment longer, before gently withdrawing it. I believe, given time, we may yet find our way back to something resembling the trust we once shared, though I suspect that path will require considerably more patience than either of us initially anticipated. I am prepared for however much patience the process requires, Draven said firmly. You are worth every effort, Ilara, and I intend to prove that conviction through my actions, for as long as it takes to fully earn your trust once again. In the days that followed, preparations for the delivery continued with methodical thoroughness, and Ilara found herself growing increasingly grateful for the careful attention and expertise being assembled specifically for her care. Mira remained a constant, reassuring presence throughout the process, working closely alongside Dr. Aldous and the additional specialists Draven had summoned, ensuring that every possible precaution was considered and implemented well in advance of the expected delivery date. Lady Vesna's careful political maneuvering continued in the background of these preparations, though Ilara remained appropriately cautious regarding the sincerity of her continued attempts at demonstrating loyalty. On one occasion, Vesna offered to provide additional midwives from her own family's considerable resources, an offer Ilara politely but firmly declined, unwilling to introduce unknown variables into the carefully controlled medical team already assembled for her care. I do not trust her intentions, Ilara admitted to Mira during one of their regular private conversations, though I cannot say with certainty whether her continued attention stems from genuine political ambition or simply anxious eagerness to demonstrate loyalty following Cassian's fall. Either way, I prefer to keep our medical team limited to those whose reliability has already been thoroughly established. A wise precaution, Mira agreed. Trust, once broken so severely as yours, was through Cassian's betrayal, rightfully takes considerable time and consistent demonstration to rebuild. There is no shame in maintaining careful boundaries, particularly regarding matters as critical as the safety of your delivery. As the final weeks of Alara's pregnancy approached, the palace itself seemed to settle into a state of anxious anticipation, the entire court aware that the birth of the royal twins would represent not only a joyful occasion for the kingdom, but a moment of genuine medical risk, given everything the physicians had indicated regarding the complications they anticipated. Draven ensured that Alara's chambers remained peaceful and protected, limiting unnecessary visitors, and ensuring that whatever stress could reasonably be minimized during these final critical weeks was addressed proactively. Alara spent much of this time in quiet reflection, watching the changing seasons through her chamber windows, feeling the increasingly vigorous movements of the children within her, and preparing herself mentally and emotionally for whatever challenges the delivery itself might ultimately present. Whatever fear remained regarding the physical dangers ahead, she found herself increasingly grounded by the steady support surrounding her, from Mira's unwavering loyalty, to Draven's consistent demonstration of care and reliability, to the careful expertise of the medical team now fully assembled and prepared for whatever complications might arise when the moment of delivery finally arrived. A sharp, tearing pain ripped through Alara's abdomen in the middle of the night, jolting her from sleep with such intensity that she cried out before she had even fully registered what was happening. The attendant stationed near her bed, alert to precisely this possibility, rushed immediately to her side. "My lady, is it time?" the attendant asked urgently, already moving toward the door to summon help. "I believe so," Alara gasped, gripping the edge of the bed as another wave of pain crashed through her. "Please, hurry. Find Mira and Dr. Aldous immediately." Within minutes, the palace erupted into carefully organized activity, servants and guards moving with practiced urgency, as word spread that the long-anticipated moment had finally arrived. Mira reached Alara's chambers first, her expression calm and reassuring, despite the gravity of the situation, immediately beginning the careful assessment that would guide the delivery ahead. "The contractions are close together already," Mira observed, checking Alara's condition with swift, practiced efficiency. "This may progress more quickly than we initially anticipated. I need you to breathe steadily, Alara, and trust in everything we have prepared for this moment." Dr. Aldous arrived moments later, accompanied by 2 additional physicians who had been specifically summoned weeks earlier in anticipation of exactly this complicated delivery. The chambers, prepared meticulously in advance, transformed quickly into an organized center of medical activity, every instrument and resource positioned precisely where careful planning had determined it should be. Draven arrived shortly after, his expression carrying visible anxiety despite his obvious attempt to project calm reassurance for Alara's benefit. "I am here," he said, moving immediately to her side and taking her hand firmly in his own. "Whatever you need, whatever support I can offer, I am here." "Stay close," Alara managed, through gritted teeth, as another contraction seized her body with punishing intensity. "Please, do not leave." "I will not leave your side," Draven promised, his voice carrying absolute conviction despite the fear evident beneath his composed exterior. Outside the chamber doors, word of the impending birth spread quickly through the palace, and soon, a small gathering of anxious advisors and attendants had assembled in the corridor, awaiting news of the outcome, with a mixture of genuine concern and political calculation regarding what the safe or unsafe arrival of the royal heirs might mean for the future stability of the kingdom. Percival, the loyal guard captain who had accompanied Draven on the desperate journey to Hollowmere months earlier, stood watch near the chamber entrance, turning away all but the most essential personnel, determined to preserve whatever peace and privacy could still be maintained amid the mounting tension of the difficult labor unfolding within. Inside the chamber, Ilara's world had narrowed entirely to the immediate, overwhelming demands of her body, each contraction arriving with punishing regularity, leaving barely enough respite between waves for her to catch her breath before the next surge of pain gripped her entirely. Mira remained a constant, steady presence at her side, her voice calm and measured, even as the physical demands of the labor grew increasingly intense. "You are doing beautifully," Mira said, wiping a cool cloth across Ilara's forehead during a brief pause between contractions. "The first child is descending well. I know the pain feels overwhelming, but your body knows exactly what it needs to do. Trust in that knowledge, and trust in everyone gathered here to support you through whatever comes next." Ilara nodded weakly, gathering what strength remained to her for the challenges she instinctively understood still lay ahead. She thought, in the brief moments of clarity between waves of pain, of everything that had led to this moment: the devastating rejection, the desperate flight through darkened forests, the constant fear of discovery and danger that had shadowed every day of her pregnancy until finally, improbably, circumstances had shifted enough to bring her here, to this chamber, surrounded by skilled physicians and the father of her children, fighting together toward the safe delivery of the twins that Cassian's cruel deception had once declared impossible. The thought of Cassian's lies, and everything they had cost her, ignited a fierce, stubborn determination within her that seemed to burn even brighter than the pain gripping her exhausted body. She would not allow his deception one final victory, would not allow fear or exhaustion to prevent the safe arrival of the very children whose existence had already disproven every false claim he had orchestrated against her. "Another contraction is beginning," Mira announced, watching the careful monitoring equipment positioned near the bed. "Focus on your breathing, Ilara. We are getting closer with each passing moment." The hours that followed passed in an exhausting blur of pain and effort, Ilara's world narrowing entirely to the immediate physical demands of labor, punctuated by Mira's steady, reassuring voice, guiding her through each successive wave of contractions, and Dr. Aldis's careful, watchful monitoring of the increasingly complicated progress of the delivery. As dawn began to break outside the chamber windows, casting pale light across the room, the situation took a sudden, alarming turn. "Something is wrong," Dr. Aldis said, his careful composure cracking slightly as he examined Ilara with mounting concern. "The first child's position has shifted unfavorably. We may need to intervene directly to prevent serious complications." Fear flooded through Ilara at these words, though exhaustion had already stripped away much of her capacity for anything beyond raw physical endurance. "What does that mean?" she managed to ask, her voice weak with strain. "It means we need to act quickly and carefully," Mira said, her own composure remaining steady, despite the evident gravity of the situation, offering Ilara a crucial anchor of calm amid the mounting chaos. "Dr. Aldis is highly skilled in exactly this kind of complication. Trust in his expertise, and continue following my guidance regarding your breathing and effort. We will get through this together." Draven, gripping Ilara's hand with white-knuckled intensity, watched the unfolding crisis with barely restrained panic, though he forced himself to maintain outward composure for Ilara's sake, understanding instinctively that any visible fear from him would only compound the terror she was already fighting to control amid the physical agony of the complicated delivery. The physicians worked with careful, practiced urgency, Dr. Aldis issuing quiet, precise instructions to his assisting colleagues, while Mira continued her steady encouragement, guiding Ilara through each critical push with calm, unwavering focus, despite the mounting tension throughout the chamber. Minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity, the entire room holding its collective breath through each increasingly difficult phase of the delivery. Finally, after what felt to Ilara like hours of impossible strain and terror, a thin, piercing cry broke through the tense silence of the chamber, and relief flooded through the room as the first child, a daughter, was safely delivered into Dr. Aldis's careful hands. "She is healthy," Mira announced, her voice carrying genuine relief as she quickly assessed the newborn before passing her to a waiting attendant for further care. "Ilara, you are doing wonderfully. One more child remains, and I need your continued strength for just a little while longer." Ilara, exhausted beyond anything she had previously believed herself capable of enduring, found fresh reserves of determination at the sound of her daughter's healthy cries echoing through the chamber. Draven, tears visible in his eyes despite his continued effort at composure, pressed a gentle kiss against Ilara's forehead. "You are doing remarkably," he whispered. "Our daughter is safe. You can do this, Ilara." The second delivery proved somehow even more physically demanding than the first. Alara's exhausted body straining against reserves that felt entirely depleted, though she pushed forward regardless, driven by fierce determination to see both her children safely into the world, despite the punishing physical toll the process had already extracted from her. A fresh wave of alarm rippled through the medical team as the second child's heartbeat, monitored carefully throughout the labor, suddenly began to show signs of distress. "The heartbeat is weakening," one of the assisting physicians reported urgently. "We need to expedite the delivery immediately." Dr. Aldis's expression grew grave with concentrated focus as he worked quickly, employing careful techniques to assist the delivery while minimizing further risk to both mother and child. Alara, though nearly beyond the limits of her physical endurance, summoned one final, desperate reserve of strength, pushing with everything she possessed, despite the agonizing exhaustion gripping every part of her body. The moment stretched with unbearable tension, the entire chamber silent save for the physician's careful, urgent instructions and Alara's ragged, exhausted breathing, until finally, blessedly, a second cry pierced the tense silence, weaker initially than his sister's had been, but growing stronger with each passing second as the newborn son adjusted to his first breaths outside the womb that had carried him through such a dangerous, complicated journey into the world. "He is stable," Dr. Aldis announced, relief evident in his voice as he carefully assessed the newborn. "Both children are healthy, given the circumstances. Alara, you have done something truly remarkable today." Exhaustion overwhelmed Alara so completely in the aftermath of the delivery that she could barely process the physician's reassurances, her body finally allowing itself to collapse into the depleted relief of having survived an ordeal more physically demanding than anything she had previously experienced, even amid the months of danger and hardship that had preceded this moment. Draven, still gripping her hand tightly, pressed his forehead gently against hers, tears now flowing freely despite his earlier attempts at maintaining composure. "You did it," he whispered. "You brought both our children safely into this world, despite everything working against you. I am so proud of you, Alara, and so deeply grateful for your strength." As the attendants carefully cleaned and wrapped both newborns, preparing them to be placed in their exhausted mother's arms for the first time, Alara felt an overwhelming wave of emotion crash over her, relief and exhaustion, and fierce protective love, all mingling together into something almost too powerful to fully process in her depleted state. The attendants placed her daughter first into her waiting arms, followed shortly by her son, and Alara stared down at the two small, precious faces, so recently the subject of such devastating denial and danger, now finally safe and healthy despite every obstacle that had stood between this moment and the false diagnosis that had once declared such an outcome entirely impossible. "They are perfect," she whispered, tears streaming freely down her exhausted face as she studied each small feature, searching for traces of both herself and Draven, reflected in their tiny, newly formed faces. "They are," Draven agreed, his voice thick with emotion as he gently reached out to touch his daughter's small hand, marveling at the tiny fingers that instinctively curled around his own larger one. "Thank you, Alara, for their lives, for your strength, for everything you endured to bring them safely to this moment, despite every attempt to prevent it." Mira, watching the tender scene with evident satisfaction and relief after the harrowing complications of the delivery, allowed herself finally to relax fully, the tension of the past several hours gradually easing from her shoulders as she observed the successful conclusion of a pregnancy that had, from its very earliest days, been shadowed by danger, deception, and uncertainty. "You should rest now," Mira said gently, though her voice carried warm affection rather than clinical detachment. "You have accomplished something remarkable today, Alara, bringing these children safely into the world despite every obstacle placed before you since the very beginning of this journey. Allow yourself the rest you have more than earned." As the first light of morning fully illuminated the chamber, casting warm golden light across the small family gathered within, word of the successful birth began to spread quickly throughout the palace, and soon throughout the wider kingdom, the news of the king's twin heirs, born to the very woman once cruelly rejected and declared barren through Cassian's deliberate deception, carrying with it an undeniable vindication that would echo throughout Veyrath for years to come. News of the successful birth reached Lady Vesna's chambers within the hour, delivered by a breathless attendant eager to share the remarkable story spreading rapidly throughout the palace. Vesna listened with carefully masked calculation, already recognizing the shifting political reality that the twins' safe arrival represented for her family's continued position within the court. "The succession is now secured beyond any reasonable challenge," she said quietly to Edmund, once the attendant had departed. "Whatever remaining hope certain factions might have harbored regarding alternative arrangements for the throne has now been entirely extinguished. We must move quickly to demonstrate unwavering loyalty to the Lady Alara and her children, before other families move to secure that same advantageous position first." Edmund nodded, understanding immediately the shift in strategy his mother's words implied. "What do you propose?" "A generous gift, appropriately grand, given the significance of the occasion," Vesna said thoughtfully. "And perhaps an offer of support that requires no immediate reciprocation, simply demonstrated goodwill, that might, over time, translate into genuine trust and renewed influence within the court." Elsewhere throughout the palace, the celebratory mood spread quickly among the nobility and staff alike, servants hurrying to prepare festivities appropriate to the joyful occasion, while messengers were dispatched throughout the kingdom, carrying word of the royal twins' safe arrival to every corner of Veyrath. Bells rang from the palace towers, a traditional announcement reserved for occasions of the greatest significance, and throughout the capital city below, citizens gathered in the streets to celebrate the news that had already begun spreading with remarkable speed. Within the private sanctuary of Alara's recovery chambers, however, the celebration remained considerably quieter and more intimate, reserved for the small circle of those who had walked alongside her through the most difficult months of her ordeal. Mira remained close throughout the following days, monitoring Alara's recovery with the same careful attention she had provided throughout the entire pregnancy, while Draven divided his time between the necessary duties of managing the kingdom's celebratory response and remaining as present as possible within the nursery, seemingly unable to tear himself away from his newborn children for more than brief, necessary intervals. "You should rest more," Mira observed gently, finding Draven once again seated beside the twins' cradle late one evening, watching over their peaceful sleep with quiet, wondering attention. "I find I cannot look away," Draven admitted, a small, wondering smile touching his lips. "After everything that happened, after the months of doubt and separation, I confess I still find myself needing to confirm, again and again, that they are truly here, truly safe." Mira settled into the chair beside him, studying the peaceful scene with quiet satisfaction. "They are safe, Your Majesty. And I believe, given everything I have witnessed these past months, that they will grow up surrounded by considerably more love and protection than many children born into far less complicated circumstances." "I hope you are right," Draven said quietly. "I owe Alara, and these children, a debt I do not believe I can ever fully repay. Every day, I find myself grateful anew that circumstances allowed me the chance to correct my earlier failures, however imperfectly that correction has managed to address the harm already done. Redemption rarely arrives through a single grand gesture," Mira observed thoughtfully. "It is built through countless smaller moments, exactly like this one, choosing presence over absence, care over careless assumption. I believe you understand that lesson considerably better now than you did months ago, Your Majesty, and that understanding will serve both you and this family well in the years ahead." As the days passed, and Alara's strength gradually returned following the physically demanding ordeal of the delivery, the small family began settling into the early, precious rhythms of life, with 2 newborn children, the daughter named Seraphine, after Draven's own grandmother, and the son named Alaric, chosen jointly by both parents, as a name carrying strength and resilience, befitting the difficult circumstances of his arrival into the world. Court life gradually resumed its normal rhythms around the joyful occasion, though the political landscape remained subtly altered by everything that had transpired, Cassian's exile creating lasting ripples throughout the careful balance of alliances and ambitions that had long characterized the kingdom's nobility. Vesna and her family continued their careful campaign of demonstrated loyalty, though Alara remained appropriately cautious, allowing trust to build gradually, rather than extending it freely, based upon calculated political gestures alone. Whatever challenges remained ahead, whatever careful navigation of court politics and rebuilding trust with Draven still lay before her, Alara found herself, in these precious early days with her children, experiencing a depth of joy and peace that felt almost impossible to fully reconcile with the devastating rejection and dangerous exile that had once seemed destined to define her entire future. The false diagnosis that had once threatened to destroy everything she valued had instead, through circumstances neither expected nor easily explained, ultimately proven the very foundation upon which a stronger, more honest future now seemed possible to build, provided everyone involved continued to learn from the painful lessons that dangerous deception had so thoroughly taught them all. On the third day following the birth, Draven appeared before the assembled court once more, this time carrying an entirely different message than the grave accusations and formal restoration he had delivered months earlier. He stood before the same great hall, though now his expression carried none of the cold fury that had characterized his confrontation with Cassian, replaced instead by unmistakable pride and joy as he addressed the gathered nobility. "It is my honor," he announced, his voice carrying warmly across the silent hall, "to formally present to this court, and to the kingdom of Veyrath, Princess Seraphine and Prince Alaric, the legitimate heirs to this throne, born safely, despite every attempt to prevent their existence from ever being acknowledged." A wave of genuine applause swept through the hall, considerably warmer and more heartfelt than the shocked murmurs that had greeted his earlier revelations regarding Cassian's betrayal. Nobles who had once whispered doubts about Alara's suitability now offered enthusiastic congratulations, some perhaps genuine, others undoubtedly calculated political positioning, though Alara, watching from a comfortable seat near the throne where she had insisted on being present despite her continued recovery, found herself too filled with genuine joy in this moment to dwell extensively on which reactions carried true sincerity. Mira stood nearby, holding Seraphine carefully, while an attendant held Alaric, both infants remarkably calm, despite the considerable noise and attention surrounding their formal introduction to the court that would one day depend upon their leadership. Alara watched her children with fierce, protective love, marveling at how far circumstances had shifted from the devastating rejection that had once seemed destined to erase her entirely from this same hall's memory. After the formal presentation concluded, and the court began the more casual celebrations that would continue throughout the remainder of the day, Draven made his way to Alara's side, settling beside her, with visible exhaustion mixed with unmistakable happiness. "They handled that remarkably well," he said, glancing fondly toward where Mira and the attendant continued to hold the twins, amid a stream of well-wishers, eager for a glimpse of the newest additions to the royal family. "They take after their mother in that regard," Alara said, allowing herself a small, genuine smile. "Remarkably resilient, even amid overwhelming circumstances." Draven studied her profile for a long moment, something warm and hopeful passing across his expression. "Alara, I know we agreed that trust would need to be rebuilt gradually, through consistent action, rather than words alone. But watching you today, watching our children finally presented safely before this court, I find myself compelled to say again how deeply grateful I am, not only for their safe arrival, but for the strength and grace you have shown throughout every difficult moment of this entire ordeal." "Thank you, Draven," Alara said softly, and found that she meant the words with considerably less reservation than she might have offered even a few weeks earlier. "We have both grown, I think, through everything that happened. Whatever the future holds, I believe we are approaching it now, with far greater wisdom than we possessed before circumstances forced such difficult lessons upon us." As the celebration continued around them, the great hall filled with warmth and genuine joy, despite the political complexities still simmering beneath the surface of court life, Alara allowed herself, finally, to fully embrace the hard-won peace of this moment, grateful beyond measure for the family she had fought so fiercely to protect, and cautiously hopeful regarding whatever future might yet unfold from the strong, if still carefully rebuilding, foundation she and Draven continued to construct together. Alara, finally allowing exhaustion to claim her fully, as her children rested peacefully against her chest, drifted toward much-needed sleep, with a profound sense of hard-won peace settling over her for the first time, in what felt like an eternity. Whatever challenges still remained ahead, whatever careful work continued in rebuilding trust and navigating the complicated political landscape of court life, this moment, this hard-fought, hard-won victory of survival and safe delivery, represented a triumph that no false diagnosis, no political scheme, no cruel deception could ever again take from her, or from the children she had fought so fiercely to protect, throughout every danger and hardship of the difficult journey that had finally, at last, reached this precious, joyful conclusion. A full year had passed since the twins' dramatic and dangerous birth, and Alara stood once more in the palace gardens, watching Seraphine and Alaric take their first wobbling steps across the grass, under Mira's careful supervision, laughter bubbling up from both children as they stumbled and rose again with the fearless determination that seemed to characterize their young personalities already. The gardens, once a place of quiet solitude during her difficult recovery months earlier, had become instead a favorite gathering spot for the small family, filled now with joy, rather than the anxious uncertainty that had once shadowed every corner of the palace grounds. "They grow more like their father every day," Mira observed fondly, catching Alaric as he stumbled directly into her waiting arms. "Stubborn and determined, even when the odds seem stacked against them." Alara laughed, settling onto a nearby bench to watch the scene unfold. "And Seraphine carries considerably more of my own caution, I think, though she seems determined not to let her brother's boldness go entirely unmatched." The past year had brought considerable change throughout the kingdom, the political landscape gradually settling into new patterns following Cassian's exile, and the dramatic revelations surrounding his betrayal. Lady Vesna's careful campaign of demonstrated loyalty had, over the months, gradually earned genuine trust rather than merely cautious tolerance. Her consistent, reliable support during the twins' early months, eventually convincing even Alara's initial skepticism that the woman's reformed loyalty carried genuine sincerity rather than purely calculated political positioning. Edmund had indeed found a position within the palace, though earned gradually through demonstrated competence, rather than granted freely through his mother's political maneuvering, currently serving as a trusted assistant to Percival within the palace guard. Draven approached now from the direction of the palace, having concluded a morning of council meetings, his expression brightening immediately at the sight of his children's continued attempts at walking across the garden lawn. He knelt down as Seraphine, spotting him, immediately abandoned her careful balance to stumble excitedly in his direction, and he caught her easily, lifting her into his arms with practiced tenderness. "How was your morning, little one?" he asked, pressing a gentle kiss against her forehead, before settling onto the bench beside Alara. Seraphine contentedly nestled against his chest. "Considerably more entertaining than yours, I would imagine," Alara said, watching him with the warm affection that had gradually, carefully, rebuilt itself between them over the course of the past year. Their relationship remained, in many ways, different from what it had once been before the devastating rejection that had nearly destroyed everything. More cautious, perhaps, more consciously communicative, but also, Alara had come to believe, considerably stronger for having weathered such a difficult trial, and emerged with both parties, genuinely committed to the honest, transparent partnership that had been so tragically absent during the crisis that had first torn them apart. "The council continues debating the proposed reforms to the succession laws," Draven said, a note of satisfaction evident in his voice. "Given everything that occurred with Cassian's deception, I have proposed additional safeguards regarding medical examinations affecting succession matters, requiring multiple independent physicians and documented evidence before any diagnosis affecting royal succession can be formally accepted. It seems only fitting that some lasting good emerge from the terrible ordeal we endured, ensuring no future family suffers the same devastating injustice you experienced." Alara felt a swell of quiet pride at this news, recognizing in Draven's continued efforts toward institutional reform the same genuine commitment to change and growth that had gradually rebuilt her trust throughout the difficult months following the twins' birth. "That is a meaningful legacy to build from such painful circumstances," she said softly. "I believe strongly that it is necessary," Draven agreed. "What happened to you should never be possible again within this kingdom, regardless of whatever ambitious schemes future courtiers might attempt to orchestrate. The safeguards I have proposed would make such deception considerably more difficult to execute successfully." As if summoned by the conversation's shift toward matters of governance, a messenger approached from the direction of the palace, bearing a sealed letter that he presented respectfully to Draven, before withdrawing to a respectful distance. Draven's expression grew thoughtful as he read the letter's contents, and Alara watched him carefully, recognizing something significant in the careful attention he was giving to whatever news the message contained. "What is it?" she asked, once he had finished reading. "Word from the border regions," Draven said, folding the letter carefully. Cassian has been sighted in a distant kingdom, apparently attempting to establish himself within a foreign court, though reports suggest his reputation has already preceded him, making such efforts considerably more difficult than he likely anticipated. Ilara absorbed this news with complicated emotions, the mention of Cassian's name still carrying some residual weight, even after a full year of distance from the immediate danger he had once posed. Do you believe he poses any continued threat? I do not believe so, Draven said carefully. Our borders remain watchful, and the terms of his exile were made clear to every neighboring kingdom, ensuring he cannot easily find allies willing to support any attempt at return or retaliation. I believe, though I understand if this feels difficult to fully accept, that his story has largely concluded. A man who sacrificed his family, his position, and his honor in pursuit of ambitions that ultimately cost him everything he sought to protect. Ilara nodded slowly, finding genuine relief in this confirmation, though she recognized that some small part of her would likely always carry cautious vigilance regarding the possibility, however remote, of Cassian's continued influence reaching toward her family from wherever his exile had ultimately taken him. But watching her children continue their joyful exploration of the garden, secure and protected within the strong foundation of family and loyal support that had been so carefully rebuilt since those dangerous, uncertain months of hiding and fear, she found herself increasingly able to release the lingering weight of that old fear, trusting instead in the genuine strength and security that now surrounded her small family. Thank you, she said quietly, turning to Draven with an expression carrying warmth that had grown increasingly genuine over the course of their long, careful journey back toward mutual trust. For everything you have done these past months, for the reforms you continue pursuing, for the consistent care you have shown, not only toward our children, but toward rebuilding what was broken between us through such painful circumstances. Draven reached out, gently taking her hand in his own. Seraphine still contentedly nestled against his chest, watching her parents with the innocent curiosity of a child too young yet to understand the complicated journey that had brought her safely into this peaceful, loving moment. I promised you, on that night I finally found you again, that I would spend whatever years remained to me, proving myself worthy of the trust I had so carelessly destroyed. I intend to keep that promise for as long as we both shall live, Ilara. You and our children deserve nothing less than complete devotion and unwavering protection, and I am grateful every single day for the chance to provide exactly that, however imperfectly I might sometimes still manage the effort. Mira, watching the tender scene from where she continued supervising Alaric's determined attempts at further exploration across the garden lawn, allowed herself a small, satisfied smile, remembering the frightened, heartbroken young woman who had once collapsed exhausted at her cottage door, carrying secrets and dangers she could not yet fully understand. The journey from that desperate night to this peaceful, joyful afternoon had been long and difficult, filled with genuine danger and heartbreaking betrayal. But watching the family now gathered together in the warm afternoon sunlight, secure in their hard-won happiness and carefully rebuilt trust, Mira found herself believing genuinely that whatever challenges the future might yet bring, this family possessed the strength, wisdom, and mutual devotion necessary to face them together, unified rather than divided by whatever trials still awaited them. As the afternoon light began its gentle transition toward evening, casting warm golden hues across the peaceful garden, Ilara watched her children continue their joyful play, watched Draven's evident devotion as he carefully guided Seraphine's continued attempts at walking, and felt, for the first time since that devastating day when she had been publicly rejected and cast out into a dangerous, uncertain world, a complete and genuine sense of peace settling fully over her heart. The false diagnosis that had once threatened to destroy everything she valued had instead, through circumstances neither expected nor easily explained, led her through danger and heartbreak toward a stronger, more honest foundation than she could have possibly imagined during those darkest, most frightening months of her exile. Her children, once declared impossible by a lie constructed for someone else's cruel ambition, now represented the very proof that truth, however long delayed, however dangerous the path toward its revelation, ultimately possessed the power to overcome even the most carefully orchestrated deception. And as she watched her small family continue their peaceful afternoon together, secure within the walls of a palace that had once cast her out in disgrace, but now celebrated her return with genuine warmth and respect, Elara understood with quiet, unshakable certainty that whatever challenges the future might yet hold, she would face them exactly as she had faced every difficulty since that terrible day of rejection, with fierce determination, unwavering strength, and the profound, hard-won knowledge that love, once truly tested and rebuilt upon honest foundations, could indeed overcome even the darkest betrayal imaginable. Later that evening, after the children had been settled into the nursery for the night, Elara found herself once more standing on the balcony outside her chambers, the same balcony where she and Draven had shared their tentative, careful conversation on the journey back from Hollowmere so many months earlier. The stars stretched brightly overhead, undimmed by the soft glow of lanterns still burning throughout the palace grounds below, and she found herself reflecting on the remarkable distance her life had traveled since that first devastating night of rejection. Footsteps approached behind her, familiar now after so many months of careful, rebuilding partnership, and she did not need to turn to know that Draven had joined her. "I received word today from Corwin," Draven said, settling beside her at the railing. "The physician Mira sought out in those early, dangerous months. He has agreed to join the palace medical staff permanently, bringing considerable expertise that I believe will serve this kingdom well for years to come, and ensuring that the kind of corruption that once infected our medical establishment through Aldrich's betrayal will find considerably less fertile ground for future exploitation." "That is welcome news," Elara said, genuinely pleased at the prospect of Corwin's continued involvement, given the crucial role he had been prepared to play during her most dangerous months of hiding, even though circumstances had ultimately allowed her to return to the palace before his direct assistance had proven necessary. "Mira speaks highly of his integrity. I am glad the kingdom will benefit from his continued service." They stood together in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars and listening to the quiet sounds of the palace settling into evening rest around them. Elara found herself thinking, as she often did during these quiet moments, of Hollowmere, of Rosalind's farmstead, of the frightened, desperate flight through darkened woods that had once seemed destined to define the remainder of her difficult, uncertain life. "Do you ever think of returning to Hollowmere?" Draven asked, as though sensing the direction of her thoughts. "I have often wondered whether you might wish to visit, to see the place that offered you refuge during such a difficult time, now that circumstances allow such a journey to be undertaken safely, rather than in desperate flight." Elara considered the question thoughtfully. "I have thought of it, actually. Mira's cottage, the widow Rosalind's kindness, the entire village that unknowingly sheltered me through some of the most frightening months of my life. I believe I would like to visit, someday, once the children are old enough to make the journey comfortably. I would like them to understand, eventually, the full story of everything that brought them safely into this world, including the kindness of strangers, who asked for nothing in return, beyond the simple decency of helping someone in genuine need." "Then we shall plan such a journey," Draven said, "whenever you feel the time is right. I confess, I would welcome the opportunity to properly thank Rosalind myself, and to see firsthand the humble refuge that protected my family during the months I so foolishly failed to protect them myself." Elara turned to study his profile in the soft starlight, appreciating once again the genuine humility that had characterized his behavior so consistently throughout the past year, a humility that stood in such stark contrast to the cold, distant certainty that had once led him to reject her so completely, without question or investigation. Whatever failures had once defined their relationship's most devastating chapter, she found herself increasingly confident that the man standing beside her now, thoughtful and consistently reliable, represented genuine growth rather than merely convenient performance for the sake of political necessity or personal guilt. "I believe," she said finally, "that we have both grown considerably from the people we once were, before everything that happened forced such painful, necessary lessons upon us. I do not know if I would have chosen this particular path toward growth, given the choice, but I find myself, despite everything we endured, genuinely grateful for the strength and wisdom we have both gained through surviving it together." "As am I," Draven agreed softly, reaching out to take her hand once more, gratified when she allowed the contact without hesitation, a small but meaningful testament to how thoroughly trust had been rebuilt between them over the careful, patient course of the past year. "Whatever challenges the future holds, Elara, I believe we are considerably better equipped to face them now, together, with the honesty and mutual respect that our relationship so tragically lacked during its most difficult trial. Below them, the palace grounds settled fully into peaceful evening quiet, the golden lanterns casting warm, steady light across gardens that had witnessed both the depths of betrayal and the heights of hard-won reconciliation over the course of the past eventful year. Somewhere within the nursery, their children slept peacefully, secure in a world that had once, through cruel deception, declared their very existence impossible, now protected by parents who had fought fiercely, through danger and heartbreak alike, to ensure they would grow up knowing nothing but genuine love, consistent protection, and the profound, hard-earned truth that even the darkest betrayal could ultimately be overcome through courage, loyalty, and an unwavering commitment to rebuilding what had once seemed irreparably broken. And as the stars continued their slow, eternal journey across the peaceful night sky above Veyrath, Alara found herself, finally and completely, at peace with the long, difficult road that had led her to this exact moment, grateful beyond measure for every painful lesson, every act of loyal kindness, and every small, courageous choice that had ultimately transformed devastating rejection into the strong, honest, and deeply loving family she now called her own.